you've picked a side during the Jagged Crown quest, the war is already decided and it's simply a matter of writing out the rest of the quest line. Also unfortunate is that the battle is more interesting for attackers than defenders. If you defend the city, then the battle simply ends with the Stormcloaks breaking and retreating, but if you attack the city, then the battle ends with a confrontation with Jarl Balgruuf, and we see his replacement Vignar Greymane immediately take control upon our victory. Balgruuf is allowed to leave the city. So where does he go? Oh, to the Sad Room. The Blue Palace has this little corner tucked away that's difficult to notice, which houses all the NPCs displaced during the Stormcloak side of the war. The palace in King's Windhelm has a similar room. I like to call it the Sad Room because it's a tacit admission of Bethesda's fear of consequences. There are still quests the player may potentially need these NPCs for, so Bethesda has to keep them around, but it doesn't actually have a place for them, so it just crams them in this little corner of the map, all because Bethesda doesn't want the player to fail quests. One of the consequences of doing the Civil War should be that you miss out on potential content, because that's war. People die, lives change, men shit in urinal. However, this may not be how things played out for you if you took Hadvar or Raylof's suggestion to go to the capital of their team to join the Civil War. See, if your first meeting with Jarl Balgruuf is to deliver the message, Balgruuf will just ignore it. He insists on dealing with the dragon problem before the Civil War, which means you have to awkwardly pivot into doing the beginning of the Skyrim main quest up to and including the point that unlocks dragons as enemies.
And I'm sure he told you it was urgent. Well, he's not the only Jarl in Skyrim with problems to deal with.
Did he now? The man is persistent, I'll give him that.
But until that dragon's dealt with, Ulfric's just going to have to wait.
For now, I'll hold on to this axe, but it's a tenuous piece at best.
Help Irileth kill this dragon before it can attack Whiterun. There's no time to lose.
You would think, as a Stormcloak, that I could just return to Ulfric and say that Balgruuf refused the axe and that the city is prime for conquest, since it won't be garrisoned with Imperials until after the dragon at the Western Watchtower is slain. What this means is that the player character has to become the Dragonborn to complete the Civil War. You might wonder if there's a reason for this, and the answer is that there's not. Well, not really. Ulfric has a line about us being Dragonborn in the conclusion of the Imperial side. Otherwise, the only reason to do things this way is that there weren't contingency voice lines for Vignar Greymane to serve that role in the main quest. It's just hilarious that Balgruuf will name us as one of Whiterun's great heroes and Thane to his city, only to not even consider our input when deciding which side to support, and even calling us a traitor for siding with the Stormcloaks, even though it's entirely possible that, again, our first meeting with him was as a Stormcloak messenger. It's a testament to how much Skyrim railroads you into doing the main quest first that I haven't seen this extremely awkward quest structure called out. It's at this point, however, that we enter into the tedious part of the quest line, the reunification or liberation of Skyrim. Before that, though, I have to mention that my VR run of Skyrim completely and utterly locked up during the Battle of Whiterun. I have tried multiple times to get it past this point and eventually succeeded, only for it to get stuck later down the line, which was annoying because the entire reason I was playing this questline a third time was to be able to record those dialogue lines about the Battle of Solitude and the Beachy wedding. Eventually it broke so bad that Jarl Balgruuf stayed Jarl of Stormcloak-aligned Whiterun, which is the ideal outcome. I really don't know what it was that broke this quest. It could have been that I switched sides to the Stormcloaks, it could have been that I wasn't Dragonborn when I first talked to Balgruuf, it could have been that the quest breaks if you play it during the full moon. Part of the problem is that the questline eludes traditional console command progression, making it difficult to force to work. I've only seen this kind of broken questline fuckery once before, and that was during the Minutemen line of Fallout 4. Both sides of the war do exactly the same quests, just in a different order. We start with a false front in the Pale for the Imperials and Hjalmarch for the Stormcloaks. In this quest, we track down a courier for the opposing side and then kill and replace them. We forge new orders for them, sabotage the military effort in the region, and then fight a battle at the local fort where we have to kill a large number of enemies. And then that minor hold is now under our control. The next quest is that we're sent to one of the southern cities. We threaten to expose the steward for crimes, either being a Talos worshipper or involved with the Thieves Guild, depending on the city. We steal proof from a very short, very easy stealth hallway and then squeeze information about a shipment of gold in the hold. We meet up with either Ralof or Hadvar and ambush the wagon. Then we fight a battle at a fort in the hold and now have taken a major hold. It is a shame that there's no battle for Markarth or Riften, but I guess it fits considering both cities are known for corruption that we take them in this manner. The final quest is to rescue some soldiers from a minor hold fort, which doubles as a battle to take the fort. Both instances have secret entrances we can use to sneak into the fort, and we can either emerge from within the fort to clear it out, or just assault it ourselves. Also, Hadvar and Ralof are there. Then we're given a final fort battle, either in Hafingar or Eastmarch, and with that it's time for the final battle at Solitude or Windhelm. There you go, fuck you, don't you ever say I just summarize every single quest in the game ever again. I easily could have spent an hour summarizing each individual stage from each questline like it was a new thing. But I would much rather use that time talking about how uncanny a mirror Skyrim has been warped into for this questline. As you can see, Solitude and Windhelm are mirrors, as are Markarth and Riften, Winterhold and Falkreath, Dawnstar and Morthal. Whiterun is the singular unique city which has been internally divided. It's funny to think that the collapse of Winterhold might have been for some irrelevant symbolism in an unfinished questline. I pointed this out when I talked about the Shivering Isles back in Oblivion, but the Skyrim Civil War is highly reminiscent of the conflict between the Golden Saints and Dark Seducers of that expansion. A conflict that continues in Skyrim thanks to the Creation Club. Anyways, the Saints and Seducers are locked into an eternal state of war vying for Senpai's attention, despite the fact that they are effectively just a mirror of each other. The Shivering Isles made a point of just how pointless the conflict was, intentionally because it reflected Sheogorath's own arbitrary internal division between mania and dementia. And now here we are, just a couple years later, doing that same pointless conflict, this time unironically.
You'll need to be careful with this one. The Jarl's men won't look kindly on you rummaging through the steward's quarters.
This will require stealth and discretion. The Jarl's guards won't take kindly to anyone rummaging through her steward's private quarters.
There are two possibilities. The first is that Bethesda recognizes the pointlessness of the war and intentionally designed it that way to make a point, and the second is that Bethesda unintentionally parodied their own conflict, and the only intentional part of making the questlines effectively identical was to ease player anxiety about content exclusivity. We either have to assume that Bethesda is intelligent, or are cowards, and unfortunately there's more evidence to suggest that Bethesda are cowards afraid of players doing repeat playthroughs than signs of intelligent quest design in Skyrim. This is the game where you're intended to just start using a new playstyle on an existing character instead of just creating a new character for that purpose. The problem I have trouble thinking about is determining whether the questline is unfinished or simply badly designed. For instance, during battles you can watch as bodies despawn, a trick Bethesda uses due to the limitations placed on the game by the 7th console generation hardware that it came out on. Their engine, as is not designed around creating battle scenarios, at least for the generation the game came out in. However, only half of the quests actually involve battles, and most of those battles are extremely simple. It's just grinding against respawning enemies until the necessary number of soldiers have been killed, and then the battle concludes. I would not be surprised if each fort battle was simply a copy of a template fort battle with all the necessary components, and the only thing designers changed is the layout. However, the other half of the questline is not met with this hardware limitation. Take the Tribute quest, for instance. It actually seems like it would be more work recreating the same exact quest for the opposite side that is still identical. It's a completely different set of NPCs in a different location with different voice lines. They had to intentionally decide to do that, which brings us back to the question of why. Well, here's the thought. It may well be possible that the Civil War originally had one joinable side, that being the Stormcloaks. Think about it. Which side is the player pushed towards in the introduction? Which side has the developed trial? Which side has a conclusion scene at the Battle of Whiterun? And never mind the Emperor's assassination. The more I think about it, the more I start to believe the Imperial side of the war may actually just be a clone of the original Stormcloak questline. Unfortunately, this theory is incorrect. You can try to sniff out the developer intentions from what's in the game, but you would very often be wrong. This is why actual research is important and not just an argument you throw in people's faces because it sounds good to tell people that they need sources. Unfortunately, while there are plenty of ex-Bethesda employees who've talked about their time working on Skyrim, one department has remained relatively silent: the quest designers. Maybe they sacrificed goats, or maybe it's as simple as the fact that while many people praise the world and artistic design of Skyrim, Skyrim's quests tend to be treated fairly unfavorably. It's been a favorite YouTube pastime to complain about Skyrim quests since 2012, which happens to be the last time anybody who worked in that area spoke at length about the topic. So unfortunately, there are not a lot of answers to the questions I've raised. We have the cutting room floor, a source I'm hesitant to use even half a year after publishing my Oblivion video. I basically said they outright fabricated a claim about there being thousands of unused voice lines in the files, something that remains unproven to this day despite how simple it would be to show their existence. Get a physical copy, put it in a computer without an internet connection, and look at the data files. So basically just stick an asterisk in this section due to a historical lack of credibility for the source.
My source is that I made it the fuck up.
They've data mined the game, and there's some interesting stuff reportedly hinted at. For starters, the quests were meant to be randomized, and there were meant to be 12 types rather than the 3 that are in the game. The quests would be given 2 at a time with dialogue for each combination. The quests that were not in the game included killing scouts, skirmishing in a minor settlement, sabotaging resources. There were rescue missions at more forts, assassination missions, recruitment of soldiers, a mission where you appease a giant, you steal war plans, recruit civilians, and you go on a vision quest with an orc. Also, pay would be determined by a salary that itself was determined by player rank in the faction, and Ulfric would additionally ask the player to donate their pay to the Stormcloak cause. There were also sieges in all the major cities, complete with dialogues for each transfer of power, including if the player loses a battle and is forced to escape the city. There were meant to be female soldiers and battle mages on both sides, and the officers you meet in the field camps were likely meant to have unique dialogue. Finally, there's a note in the Civil War script for modders that reads as follows. The Civil War has gone through many iterations. There's a lot of obsolete stuff in here from previous iterations where it was more dynamic and freeform. So, for various reasons, it seems that Bethesda had aimed for the stars with the Civil War questline, and reading this article makes a lot of sense in addition to Bruce Nesmith's talk on Radiant's story. Actually, it's rather interesting that the Civil War has no Radiant quests, making it the only secondary questline to not include any Radiants. However, even with this cut content, the questline still has that element of being effectively identical. Which I guess means that even in its current state, the story accomplishes its goal of being a pointless conflict for the sake of pointless conflicts. I guess you would have to continually lose ground to see all the mission types in a single playthrough, so each repeat playthrough would have a different order of Radiant missions. And it would probably help seeing the different transfers of power. We can only speculate on what really happened with the questline, so let's speculate. I'm going to guess that, had Bethesda not hinted at the Civil War in the trailers, the whole deal might have gotten the Count of Kavach treatment. However, Bethesda implied there would be a civil war and tied it into the main quest, but they didn't have time to finish it, so they simply collated the most functional elements into a single linear narrative for each questline. Now, I should mention Season Unending, which is part of the main quest where you can negotiate a temporary truce. However, I'm going to talk about that in the main quest section. All it really does is just add more battles for whichever territory ends up changing sides during the negotiation. With that out of the way, let's conclude the Civil War. For the Imperials, we lay siege to Windhelm. Actually, there's no opposition keeping us from just entering the city. We fight our way through infinite enemies until we reach the Palace of Kings, where we confront Ulfric, Stormcloak, and Galmar. Galmar dies, and it comes down to a final execution of Ulfric. We don't capture him, we just decide to end it here and now. Ulfric will request that we do it, as we're the Dragonborn. We can decide whether or not to, and then General Tullius gives a speech to the men. For the Stormcloaks, we attack Solitude. I took the time to visit the Blue Palace during the battle because the game doesn't stop you. It's pretty much just business as usual here. It's quite surreal. There's a battle going on outside. Anyways, we take Castle Dower, and General Tullius is having a little pout in the corner, having been defeated. That's not me editorializing. The game itself does portray the characters in that way. Ricka dies in combat, Tullius is summarily executed, and Jarl Elisif honors Ulfric's claim to become High King of Skyrim. The end. It's a pretty straightforward questline that is not ambitious. It has a lot of awkward dialogue scenes and even more fast travel since you have to go back to the capital during each leg of the story. It's funny that of all the questlines in Skyrim, the one that was made central to the actual open world was left so unfinished. Okay, so I tried to make it this far without outright stating my opinions or thoughts on the conflict. Some of you might have picked it out from the subtext or have seen my streams where I've talked about the issue, in which case you already know which side I support. I want to say that before I outright state it, that my goal is to try and clear some of the air surrounding this questline and misconceptions that people tend to spread. I support the Stormcloaks. Now, my character Delta Fear supported the Stormcloaks because she was a Morrowind national who's lived long enough to remember the Empire abandoned her homeland. I think that Stormcloaks are grandly mischaracterized in a big way.
I don't like the fact that he's so racist against elves, and mainly all races that are not Nord.
But the Stormcloaks are downright xenophobic and almost kind of racist at times, and they act like a bunch of misguided and violent rebels.
Windhelm has immigration and racism.
The only real issue I take is with the Stormcloaks and the aforementioned rampant racism.
So a lot of people claim the Stormcloaks are racists, and I know why. It's because when you first enter Windhelm, you see this.
You come here where you're not wanted. You eat our food, you pollute our city with your stink, and you refuse to help the Stormcloaks.
But we haven't taken a side because it's not our fight.
Hey, Maybe the reason these Greyskins don't help in the war is because they're Imperial spies.
Imperial spies? You can't be serious.
Maybe we'll pay you a visit tonight, little spy. We got ways of finding out what you really are.
As you can see, Stormcloak soldiers are harassing a Dunmer woman in the streets of Windhelm. Oh wait, those aren't Stormcloak soldiers. I modded the game to give them that armor. In fact, one of those two men is homeless, and the other's a drunk that lounges around at a bar all day. The only connection that these men have to the Stormcloaks is that they live in Windhelm, and Rolf is Galmar's brother. Galmar's another common sticking point I've seen people have with the Stormcloaks, but he seems reasonable to me. In fact, Galmar's a lot like the Nords we used to see in the series. Nords used to be a culturally distinct people whose bravado and brusqueness was merited by their strengths as warriors. However, come Skyrim, and most of them just seem to be milk-drinking peasants and regular humans. Galmar actually seems to be a sliver of that old warrior culture the Nords were always meant to be. He's also not a racist. When the player joins, he'll ask why we would be interested in fighting for Skyrim. However, he asks Nords the same question. He simply wants to ascertain where our loyalties lie, which is a lot more important for the Stormcloaks than it is the Legion. If the Legion loses the conflict, they will continue to exist as a faction, but if the Stormcloaks lose, that's it. It's over. As for Ulfric, he also isn't a racist, but you know who is culturally intolerant?
You Nords and your bloody sense of honor. Tell me again why I'm wasting men chasing after a fairy tale. Don't you Nords put any stock in your own traditions? Without us to keep order, the provinces would fall into barbarism and lawlessness. Especially Skyrim. Any last requests before I send you to wherever you people go when you die? His head will be sent to Cyrodiil, where it will adorn a spike on the walls of the Imperial City. I can't say I'll ever get used to the damn cold, or understand these Nords. But I've come to respect them.
But the Grey Quarter, yeah, what other city in Skyrim has a cultural embassy of refugees following the Red Year? Where was Solitude during that crisis? While we do see Dunmer across Skyrim, only Windhelm has a sizable population. Also, it should be stated that the current capital of a free and independent Morrowind following the Argonian invasion is the city of Blacklight, which is actually geographically closer to Windhelm than Riften. Now, of course, how Ulfric treats this population says a lot about his opinion of the Dunmer people. However, I'd argue that most of Windhelm's Nordic population is not much better off than the Grey Quarter. Windhelm is just kind of all around a terrible city to live in. Most of Skyrim's actually a terrible place, with Solitude and Whiterun being the only decent places to live, although Solitude seems to be a community that has long since priced out its poor through its limited real estate. Remember, the player character is a member of the upper class in Skyrim society. The thing is, there's actually a decent number of high elves living in Windhelm. They own the stables, the alchemist's shop, and a stall in the market. There's even a gang of exclusively high elves. That's how many of them there are. Now, why is it that the Dunmer are victims of racism, but the high elves, who I will remind you are the same race as the Thalmor, why do they suffer no ill effect? I'll let you in on a little secret. It's because the Dunmer are terrible people. Not to say they inherently deserve to be discriminated against, nobody does, but anybody who's played Morrowind can tell you a couple things about Dunmer culture. They are prideful and xenophobic, they discriminate against people of their own race for not being pure enough to have been born in Morrowind. They used to keep slaves, and they worship Daedra. The main quest of Morrowind was about stopping a Dunmer ethnic nationalist who wanted to commit genocide against Outlanders. The Red Year was, in a meta-sense, retaliation for how Morrowind presented and normalized the culture of the Dunmer, and I hold it in spite for ruining the legacy of the Nerevarine. Instead of the Dunmer becoming a more tolerant race under the leadership of their cultural icon, Daddy went out for cigarettes and they had to be punished by the writers for being naughty boys, slavery. Then the writers decided to create a refugee crisis, presumably as some form of social commentary, although Skyrim would actually predate the American obsession with Europe's refugee crisis by a couple years, so either someone at Bethesda is extremely politically savvy, or more likely it's meant to reflect on America's own historical issues with immigration. Now, of course, I would be loath to forget the 4 Argonians living out in the waterfront. So this is kind of a confusing element, but Ulfric outright forbade Argonians from entering the city. Now, is this identical to how every other city in Skyrim banned the Khajiit caravans? Sure, but we're just going to pretend that's not happening because it makes Elisif and Balgruuf look bad. See, the bigotry people in Windhelm have against the Dunmer makes a degree of sense. They think they're spies and whatnot. But what have the Argonians done to earn the ire of the Nords? The Argonians seem to think that it's your typical class struggle. The Nords are entitled and they don't want to work on the docks, so the Argonians have to do it instead. Funny thing is, Ulfric's replacement Brunwolf actually maintains the order of segregation, but instead of segregating to protect the locals, it's to protect the Argonians. Like a reflection of the real world. But the thing is, I can't help but imagine Ulfric was also protecting the Argonians. You have to remember that part of the devastation of the Red Year was an Argonian invasion of Morrowind. While it was retaliatory for the slavery of Argonians, Morrowind showed that plenty of Dunmer commoners were not slaveholders. You have a city that's already suffering from one racial conflict, which is going downhill due to the local leader having to balance his resources between a war for independence and city maintenance. And then you want to add the element of another racial group who have historical problems with your refugee population. Things might be better if the docks literally didn't connect straight into the Grey Quarter. Anyways, I consider the Argonians a non-issue compared to the Grey Quarter, and the Grey Quarter is definitely an issue. However, it's not like Ulfric had years to clean the place. Oh, wait, he's been fighting for Skyrim's independence for as long as he's been Jarl, which has been 20 years. Okay, maybe that's a black mark. However, I also think that's simply an issue of Bethesda not understanding how long time is. This is not the first questline in Skyrim to run up against this timeline issue, to the point that I think the game was supposed to take place in 191 instead of 201. Now that I've presented one argument against Ulfric, let's talk about Elisif the Fair, Jarl of Solitude and presumed High Queen of Skyrim following an Imperial victory. One of the first encounters you have with her, which often bugs out and doesn't play, is a court audience where a member of the Dragonbridge community requests that Elisif send someone to investigate strange lights that they've been seeing. Elisif initially suggests sending a legion, however she has to be talked down to just a couple extra guards being deployed to Dragonbridge. Elisif isn't really in control of her own hold. Her inexperience means that she's become reliant on her council of advisors to manage it for her, and General Tullius is fighting her war. She is, in essence, just a puppet ruler. So let's talk about the people Elisif has surrounded herself with. Thane Bryling is the owner of Rockwalla Mine, a mining operation that isn't even located inside of Hafengar. Falk Firebeard seems to be primarily running the hold, a duty he's compromised by having a secret relationship with Bryling. Sabella Stentor is Elisif's court wizard who will openly admit to only continuing this duty out of her own self-interest. She'll even admit to the steward that she figures Elisif will be replaced in a matter of months. Also, she's a vampire. She's been in the court long enough for people to start to notice, but nobody questions it because they need her service. People around the palace know that she's been visiting the dungeons for blood, and the warden even admits that she comes looking for volunteers. Finally, we have Erikr. He's our Thieves Guild contact. While Clan Battleborn in Whiterun was in bed with the Thieves Guild, Erikr is actually our highest ranking contact. Our job with him ends in a person being framed and sent to prison for life over a broken trade agreement. He also harasses a servant girl at a party during the main quest and is suspected to be the originator of much of the dissension spread about Falcon Bryling. There was even a cut quest that involves the assassination of Elisif, in which Erikr would take over as Jarl of Solitude, although obviously that one's not in the game. Point is, Erikr's a snake and is exactly the type of Nord that Ulfric hates. He even imports low-quality elven equipment from Black Marsh to sell to the Empire, so his avarice does not stop at his allegiance. He'll admit that half of Solitude owes him money and he owns most of the city. Since we took a good long look at Windhelm and its issues, let's look at Solitude. For starters, very few people actually live in the city. Let's analyze who gets that privilege. Vittoria Vici, overseer of the East Empire Company and cousin of the Emperor. The player character, at the price of 25,000 gold. Advar the fish merchant, Yvette San, the food merchant, Yala the produce merchant, girlfriend of Attar, the warden and executioner. You have Erikr and Bryling's houses, we've gone over where their money comes from, and the Blue Palace, home of the Jarl. There's also the Bard's College, which makes money from tuition costs of having the only school for bards in Skyrim, a desirable career path for Nords. On the other side of town are the businesses which double as their owners' homes. So, unless you're a business owner, the only way you can actually live in Solitude is to either be a guard, live in Castle Dower, a student at the college, or be a servant of the Jarl. Hell, Noster Eagle-Eye almost seems to be a union-appointed homeless person, probably only tolerated due to being an Imperial veteran, given how often he mentions it. Seriously, it is insane how much of a wealth inequality problem there is in Solitude. Remember that Solitude has long been the seat of the High King of Skyrim, so this is not a recent problem. Where was the wealth of Solitude during the Red Year, during the Great Collapse in Winterhold, or the burning of Riften, or the rebellion in Markarth? Is it any coincidence that Solitude's inaction during those crises have led to the affected holds deciding that, yeah, now's the time for change? Alright, now, counterpoint. Ulfric is actually a Thalmor puppet. I can't even begin to describe the number of times this has been stated to me as though I don't know it. At least one person's already left a comment about it and may now either be deleting or editing it. During the main quest, the player can get their hands on a couple Thalmor dossiers, including one for Ulfric Stormcloak. Most people just read the first two words and call it a day. Status, asset. Well, there you go. Ulfric's Stormcloak is a Thalmor plant.
Anyone read the next few sentences?
This document details how Ulfric was taken prisoner during the Great War and then says, quote, "We learned of his potential value and he was assigned as an asset to the interrogator, who is now First Emissary Elenwen," end quote. During this period, Ulfric was gaslit into falsely believing that he had leaked information used to capture the Imperial City and then was allowed to escape. Later on, quote, "After the war, contact was established and he has proven his worth as an asset. The so-called Markarth incident was particularly valuable from the point of view of our strategic goals in Skyrim, although it resulted in Ulfric becoming generally uncooperative to direct contact," end quote. There you go, case closed. If this doesn't raise questions for you, then you aren't thinking critically enough. Notice how the document leaves out key details about what the nature of the contact was that led to the Markarth incident. We'll assume direct contact, but we don't know anything else. For instance, it's very well possible that Elenwen had made promises to Ulfric she was not intent on keeping. She may have, for instance, told Ulfric to retake the city, promising free Talos worship as compensation. A big clue is that Ulfric, following the incident, became uncooperative. Why would a Thalmor puppet become uncooperative unless he was promised something that was then used against him? The Thalmor obviously can't write in their official report that they had promised free Talos worship in exchange for something. That would be akin to the CIA writing down that they paid someone in cocaine and not, quote, alternative recreational assets. Plus, it's also possible that the document's written in such a way to make its republication difficult for whoever steals it. After all, the likeliest group to assault the embassy and get their hands on the dossier would be, who else? Stormcloaks. If anything, the entire document could even be a fabrication existing solely to sow dissension. But the Thalmor wouldn't do something like that, right? There are many things, but they're not liars. It's not like this piece of information could be strategically released should the Stormcloaks win just to spark up another civil war against Ulfric. The latter half of the dossier states that the Thalmor have a stated interest in the civil war continuing, which, well, yeah, that should be pretty obvious. They even admit that they were going to intervene in Ulfric's execution, but were only stopped by the sudden arrival of a dragon. This intervention could range from claiming that Ulfric's their prisoner for being a Talos worshipper, to faking a Stormcloak attack to enable his escape. The final line of the dossier is also important, quote, "A Stormcloak victory is also to be avoided," end quote. So yeah, I don't consider this dossier to be a particularly conclusive piece of evidence in this discussion. It's like saying that the Imperial's account of Ulfric's duel with Torrig is objective evidence. It's obvious that the Empire is spreading a stretched truth to make Ulfric's duel sound like murder, while it's also obvious that the Stormcloaks are spreading their own stretched truth to justify the duel taking place. To explain this, let's talk a bit about Game of Thrones. I haven't read the books or even really seen the show, just clips on YouTube, but in that story we hear a lot about Jaime Lannister's murder of the Mad King that he swore to protect. Most people accept the narrative that Jaime did it because his father was taking the city and he switched sides, conveniently betraying his oath and only keeping his position because of nepotism. King Robert has only heard the story from Eddard Stark, who did not witness the full context. However, Jaime shares additional context that the Mad King was about to burn King's Landing to the ground, and that's why he did him in. The point of all that is to show how each person has different perspectives on an event colored by their bias. While the unreliable narrator trope can and absolutely has been used as a shield for lazy writing, when done properly it also has the potential to create a lot of intrigue in a story. The fact is that there's generally not an objective account of events. It's like a messy breakup where you're friends with both parties. You cannot take either partner's account of the other at face value. It's hard to give credence to the idea that the Thalmor made Ulfric a sleeper agent when the only documentation we have even acknowledging Ulfric's imprisonment is from the Thalmor. Seems like a biased perspective to me. There's also a point where Ulfric and Elenwen are in the same room, and the only line hinting at any past relationship is this.
But she is to observe, nothing more. We are not negotiating with her. Is that clear?
Ulfric, why so hostile? After all, it's not the Thalmor that's burning your farms and killing your sons.
She's supposed to be on our side?
No, exactly. No. Not this time.
The player also can't take the dossier to anybody. Not even Delphine will comment on it. Now, I would consider that an oversight, but it's still evidence. So let's work backwards from our initial questions, starting with this. Is Ulfric Stormcloak the right person to be the High King? Well, for one, I think he wins by default. All of the Jarls are characterized as being flawed in different ways. Some are naive, some are corrupt, some are only mildly competent. Skyrim's political infrastructure results in only a few holds being home to High Kings and Winterhold's now out of contention. That means it's a choice between Elisif and Ulfric, and as nice a person is, I don't think Elisif would do well as the High Queen. But that doesn't make Ulfric a good king. He clearly has charisma, which will go a long way in creating both a Skyrim that can stand on its own, but also very necessary alliances. Unfortunately, we aren't really told if Ulfric is taking steps to actually, create those alliances. He has no children for political marriage. He's not even married himself. He's already middle-aged. Charisma is not the only characteristic of a good leader. However, Ulfric does show some wisdom in leadership. I'm not going to mention what Ulfric has to say after he dies just yet. I'll defer that to the main quest line. But if you know what I'm talking about, I'll explain why what he says is not convincing evidence. Can I take a second to just rant about Brunwulf Freewinter? I don't even know where I'm going to put this because I'm writing this after recording a clip of me talking to him, but I just have to complain. Brunwulf is a brilliant character in that he reflects a very real type of person in the world, which is the activist who refuses to associate with anybody who doesn't already agree with his platform, or in essence, a complete waste of oxygen. So I had to look up where to find him, and once I did, I realized I hadn't even really seen this character in Windhelm, and I had spent a decent chunk of time in the city. Then, when you talk to him, he immediately establishes whether you believe Skyrim is for the Nords or for everybody. He has different dialogue if you're a Nord, but the end result is that if you disagree with him, he isn't going to waste his time talking to you, and you can't speak with him again. That's just it. Which is hilarious, because he has a line of dialogue that I wanted to reference in this video that could make a compelling counter-argument to the Stormcloaks. Brunwulf has a favorite quest, which is Radiant, but part of establishing that quest is a line that says that Ulfric only protects Nordic settlements in his hold. It's a good argument to include. Except Brunwulf is only brave enough to make it to people who cater to his sensibilities. But even then, it actually didn't appear for me because the quest is bugged, and he won't give it to you if you already cleared the dungeon he wants to send you to. And I think that really says something about Bethesda's ability to tell stories. Basically, the main counter-argument in Windhelm against Ulfric, and it has a chance of bugging out. Nothing about Windhelm seems thought out beyond the surface level. Brunwulf suggests the Great War shouldn't have happened because it led to Ulfric's rebellion, almost completely oblivious to why the Great War happened in the first place and how, even if the Empire had acquiesced to the Thalmor's demands, that Ulfric still would have rebelled. You would think as a veteran of the conflict that he would know firsthand the reality of the Thalmor and the Aldmeri Dominion. They are literally even more racist than Nords. The Nords just talk a lot of shit. The Thalmor send hit squads out to kidnap people so that they can torture them to death in order to impose their worldview that their race is supreme. Brunwulf is very clearly just the war veteran who opposes Ulfric character. He should never have been made Jarl of Windhelm unless Bethesda was prepared to actually revamp this character to be much better.
Whenever a group of marauders attack a Nord village, Ulfric is the first to sound the horn and send the men.
Sounds reasonable.
But a group of Dark Elf refugees gets ambushed, a group of Argonians or a Khajiit caravan, no troops, no investigation, nothing.
Okay, pause. The Red Year was 200 years ago. There are no longer refugees coming from Morrowind, only immigrants. The Khajiit caravans are part of a criminal syndicate, and I seriously doubt there are traveling groups of Argonians out roughing it in this part of the world. You may have noticed what kind of weather we have here. Further, I don't know if you've noticed, but there's a war going on, there are dragons about, and you're complaining about Ulfric protecting his vassals but not being able to help wanderers. You can send soldiers to protect a settlement, but what are they going to do about a highway robbery? By the time the Stormcloaks would arrive, the bandits would be gone. That's why the bandits are so dangerous. I mean, obviously this is all underdeveloped. Bethesda can barely wrap their heads around a timeline of events, let alone consistently portray this conflict. They showcase Dunmer farmers going off to join the Legion, but we never see Dunmer recruits. Obviously, the real answer for the best High King is me. Fuck Ulfric, let the Dragonborn run Skyrim into the ground. Should Skyrim be independent? No, it'll be the base of my new empire. Can it survive independence? No, because men are pigs that deserve to be slaves under Dunmeri masters. Now, generally as a rule, I plan on not talking about Tez 6 rumors, but for this I have to let it slide. Apparently they want to do a more in-depth political system. Yeah, I'm sure it'll work this time just like it didn't with Morrowind and the Great House Council, in Oblivion with the counties, and in Skyrim with the Civil War. And I'm sure the political climate of the world post-2014 is going to lead to a very thrilling and nuanced political story. Look at Fallout 4. Look and weep. They had all the opportunity in the world to make a four-sided conflict and still fumbled the world building when it came to the factions' motivations. To be honest, it comes off as chasing something that isn't authentically Bethesda anymore. Fallout 4 is the way it is because people like New Vegas more than 3 and Bethesda noticed. And Elder Scrolls has been chasing the politics of Daggerfall, even though in reality that doesn't seem to be what they want to do. They want to make these open world games with a focus on player exploration.
I mean, that's sort of our main character of the game is what is the world, and it helps define so much of the game for us. that walking around and just exploring and finding things, I think, is probably, the most fun you can have in this game.
They feel compelled to do these kinds of stories without really understanding what it is people want for them. If you're going to have a faction conflict, you have to start with a faction. Bethesda seems to have difficulty with world building, often going back to the well of other, more creative people to pull from. Bethesda didn't use the Brotherhood of Steel because they understood the nature of the faction and had a story to tell with it. They used it because it was familiar. In order to properly build a faction, you have to start with characters. The fact that Ulfric is ambiguously old or that he's been running Windhelm for a long time should not be nebulous. It should be established. It should be central to his character. How do you plan to make Skyrim great again when you can barely manage your own city? Ulfric should feel insecure about the state of Windhelm. He should be prepared to justify it to the player character. His explanation could be seen as a flaw or valid based on how the player interprets the situation. The same thing should be done for Tullius and Elisif. General Tullius as is comes off as a Floridian forced on a work trip to somewhere cold. He doesn't show any concern for Skyrim or its people, but the game isn't trying to make the case that he's necessarily ruthless. It just doesn't want to take the time to have Tullius discuss how he's worried for the future of his own homeland, and how he's angry that he has to waste resources fighting Nords when he should be preparing his men to fight the Dominion. A lot of this is based on things we're told in the game, but the game's rather coy with how it hands out information. It's enough to infer meaning without actually having to commit to having all the answers. It all comes off as a plastic conflict, which becomes confusing given the existing plasticity of Fallout 3 and 4. It's hard to believe the point of the Civil War is just to be pointless so a few lines of dialogue in Sovereign Guard can be more impactful. Guys, isn't it weird how war is pointless? Fuck off, there are plenty of valid reasons for war, especially in Elder Scrolls. Luckily for me, I myself can have a point to this section. Skyrim's user interface looks pretty good. I like the minimalist approach, which harkens back to the straightforward nature of the Morrowind user interface. Unfortunately, Skyrim's user experience is awful. Ironically, that also goes back to Morrowind, albeit the Xbox version of the game. See, back then it wasn't unusual to have two user interfaces, one for PC with the mouse and keyboard and one for console for controllers. The reason being that each user engages with the system in different manners. Skyrim's UI works better on consoles than Oblivion's by merit of giving more information. However, the user interface is a known failure on PC, one that even Todd Howard mods out.
Well, there's a number I like. On the PC, the UI one is really, really good.
No, that isn't a feeling of deja vu. Literally the exact same thing has happened twice. Todd Howard is advertising a new DLC release for an Elder Scrolls game and says that he uses an interface mod for it. He does not support creating a new UI. He goes ahead with maintaining his old practice of console parity. He doesn't even release script functionality for interface mods to work without a third-party installation. Something, it's weird that it's happened twice. But what's so bad about Skyrim's interface that led to SkyUI becoming one of the most installed mods? And what does SkyUI do that makes it so much better? Skyrim continues the tradition of a panel-based UI system where each panel is given its own screen. You have your inventory, magic, map, and character panels. Skyrim added a menu which serves as a sort of transition slide between these four, although it's awkward because there's more than 4 panels. There's also the menu, the journal, the statistics, and the weight tabs. The transition menu will tell you the time and level progress. It would be neat if you could pin skills to be tracked on this menu to see them quickly, and the time display is pointless because the weight menu also tells you this information, but allows you to actually do something with it and can be reached just as easily. From here, down goes to the map. Skyrim opts for a 3D render of the game map, which to pull off they had to dunk the resolution of everything down. It's nice to look at, but I find myself often replacing this map with something more functional because I do modded playthroughs where knowing roads is important. Although, obviously at this point I know every road in Skyrim basically by heart. Local map is also still there just hanging on without a purpose because it's like, what dungeon am I supposed to get lost in and actually need it? I will say that Skyrim's map is superior for giving more of a bird's eye view as opposed to Oblivion's tight little viewport, but I ultimately still find myself a fan of Morrowind's map, which updates with a texture for areas you've already explored. Going up the menu takes us to the character sheet, which has been converted to this radial view of the heavens. Stylish, sure, the only reason I let it slide is that there's no functional reason to have a top-down view of all of our stats at once anymore. Add that back in and, well, the left and right menus are where people actually have problems, which is the bulk of what SkyUI actually replaces. Skyrim's inventory presents a banner of item categories with favorites at the top and an all menu second. Of course, the all menu continues to be a pointless addition because there's no reason in an itemized list system to want to see a continuous list of all the items you have in your inventory. The all section in Morrowind was fine because it used an icon system. The items were still organized by type, making locating specific items inside the entirety of your inventory very easy. Now on the surface, switching from icons to itemization is not an issue. Both systems have upsides and downsides. The upside of itemized systems is that it's easier to create divisions for organization as long as you have a consistent system for classifying items. Skyrim uses these divisions: weapons, apparel, potions, scrolls, ingredients, food, books, keys, and miscellaneous. As usual, the last tab is used as a catch-all, and boy does it catch a lot. Which was a problem that Oblivion had, yet for some reason is mostly unfixed in Skyrim. Miscellaneous includes crafting items and soul gems, which honestly should be their own tabs, especially since routine soul gem recharging is a universal mechanic. Anyways, once you select a category, a second banner appears that lists all of the items in your inventory in that category. Once an item's selected, it'll pop up in the main viewport with a description, some stats, and its model. Where the system starts to fall apart is when there's too many items in a category. Your only option for sorting is alphabetical, and there are no icons to distinguish between items. Where this appears ugliest is in the potions menu. Many potions in the game, unsurprisingly, start with the word potion. Potions and poisons are intermingled, and after some time the list can become so long that it's hard to really have a bearing on where in the list you are outside of the top and bottom. Potions have always been a sore spot in these systems, especially given how much more of a reliance this game has on them. And the Pip-Boy system's never been much better for medical supplies in Fallout. The UI is pretty wasteful in terms of presentation. While for some stuff like weapons and quest items it's good to see the item, for potions it would probably be better to cut out the model view and just increase the banner size so that you can see the potion stats, which is pretty much exactly what SkyUI does in this situation. I would also do more to make sure that I can, at a glance at just the list, tell which potions have which effects. I would organize the potion menu by effect. There's no reason to have 6 different locations for healing potions just because there are multiple tiers. You can use colors in this situation to help distinguish because it all becomes a blur of white text on a semi-opaque black background, and have the restore potions match their respective color of juice. However, all of these problems get worse with container inventories. Most things you loot have a pretty straightforward list with a small selection of items, which is where the system shines. The leveled lists are so consistent that I can process what I've received very quickly. It's when you start using containers back at the house that the default Skyrim user interface starts to break down. For some reason, it was decided that the only mode for container inventories would be all. This means that you have to scroll down a list of everything that is in the container. Now that's fine if you can organize your setup, however Skyrim does not have a free place mode for containers, meaning that you're at the mercy of the designers how well you can actually organize your play space. I usually have a container for alchemy supplies, crafting materials, generic items, and finally a trash can for items I want to sell. But even then the system's unideal because these containers won't sort entirely alphabetically, but equipment will actually be organized statistically. You are not given any recourse for organizing the list like you are in Oblivion. Skyrim's also lacking the basic feature of being able to designate items as junk to make clearing your inventory quicker. This leads to carry weight bloat as items pile up even with frequent cleanings. The bad inventory system results in the aforementioned apathy threshold problem where potions go unused because going to the effort of finding a specific potion that you use once every couple hours is greater than your willingness to brute force the problem. I do have to wonder though, the claim is often made that Skyrim's user interface is designed to work better for consoles for mass accessibility, but I recall most of these problems being true on the 360 as well. While the menu does control slightly better with the controller, most of its issues actually stem from a lack of options being made available to the player, spreadsheeting and what have you. There are still several buttons going unused on a controller that could do functions like changing the organization parameters. Really, what Skyrim's menu does is be straightforward and easy to understand in the early game. The problems only become manifest if you try to engage with the game for more than a couple hours, which obviously Skyrim is a game with dozens of hours of content. The obvious expectation is that if you're really going to be some kind of power gamer intent on seeing everything, you are probably playing on a system that can modify the bad menu for something better, just as Todd intended, which takes us to the magic menu. It's a mirror of the inventory, but with magic favorites and all, in case you want to see a list of all the magic you have in the game. There are reasons for non-magic players to visit this menu since the Dragon Shout's racial powers and status effects list are all in this part of town. The magic is then subdivided into their respective schools. It's not bad unless you get entirely too much magic, and then it's as bad as any part of the inventory menu, especially Dragon Shouts, because there's a wide variety of different effects the shouts can have, all located in one list. Overall, the clunkiness of the system is almost entirely fixed by SkyUI. It has divisions for item types, but also subdivisions for types of items. You can sort by apparel, but if you're looking for boots, you can also sort and scroll down to the feet section. Although the funniest part of Sky UI is the simple fact that it really accomplishes the same thing as the default user interface. Saying that the UI has to be this way because the item card and model view are inaccurate, because Sky UI accomplishes the same exact goals while still giving you an efficient method of finding items. Really, there's no reason why Bethesda can't create two user interfaces and give the player the option to pick which one they want. You're telling me they had time to make a high-resolution texture pack for PC, but not a modified UI scheme. Yeah, it's one thing to ask that of some studio of overworked developers who have bigger fish to fry. It's another when it's a studio with access to money-printing franchises, publisher support, and an internal desire for a better user interface system from its executive producer. Skyrim's soundtrack is, in my opinion, the best in the entire Elder Scrolls series, in a lot of ways. It's a culmination in ideas from Morrowind and Oblivion while expanding on those ideas. In Morrowind, music worked by the game just picking an MP3 file based on whether or not you were in a fight. Oblivion expanded that by adding dungeon and town tracks, increasing both the variety of music you can hear, as well as setting the tone for what was happening through the music. Skyrim does that as well, but even further expanded. There are tracks for the time of day, taverns, castles, and specific moments. The DLC even added more music, including some of my favorite songs in the entire franchise, such as the Falmer Valley and Solstheim themes. I'm not really interested in doing a track-by-track analysis of Skyrim. The music is absolutely integral to the success of the game, there's no doubt in my mind about that, but I probably overextended myself by doing that for Morrowind. Rather, I want to talk about Jeremy Soule. I blurred his name out in my Harry Potter video, and some people speculated about why that was, but I never directly answered. I actually didn't even do it originally, and my goal with that was not to exclude him. Rather, the reason I did it was that the point was to encourage viewers to think about the average people who make shovelware games. And unfortunately, commenters were gravitating towards noticing Soule's name in the credits, defeating the entire purpose of the section because people were only talking about the one famous guy who worked on the games. Now, the speculation goes that I did it because of sexual assault allegations against him, but it's not that simple. It's been assumed that because Soule has been quiet since then and hasn't done much professional work that he must have done it. However, the much likelier explanation for Soule's disappearance actually has to do with his company, Direct Song, as well as a Kickstarter campaign he has done. Legal troubles are universally a bigger damper on creativity than getting canceled on Twitter. When I made my previous videos, I had no idea about the story. Someone offhandedly commented about it, and I happened to see that comment, and that's the only reason I know about it. Which is pretty crazy given what happened. You would think people would have mentioned this a lot. I really hope someone watching this decides to expand it into being a full, detailed breakdown or journalistic article. Direct Song was Jeremy Soule's label, founded in 2005 to publish digital and later physical versions of his soundtracks. He was already halfway through his career as a composer at that point. What's important to note is that Soule, for a long time, produced multiple OSTs per year. After 2010, he really slowed the number of OSTs he was producing, but there was a drastic increase in production quality per soundtrack, notable examples being Skyrim in 2011 and Guild Wars 2 in 2012. But when it came time to sell those soundtracks, well, this is where problems began to emerge. Firstly, the Dawnguard and Dragonborn unique tracks were never digitally sold. Oftentimes, the versions Direct Song offered were higher quality, whereas you have to listen to these tracks through ripping software from the game files. But Direct Song started to have issues with actually delivering the products that people were purchasing. In one case, someone received a physical copy of the Guild Wars 2 soundtrack that they purchased in January of 2013 in June of 2017. There wasn't a lot of transparency about why there were issues with delivering these goods. If it was as simple as manufacturing delays or money troubles, and that was stated, people would have probably been pretty forgiving. Part of the problem was how Direct Song actually operated. For Guild Wars, you could use the higher quality purchased soundtracks to replace the music in the game, but there ended up being a lot of issues with that business model. One of those issues apparently being that Soule held the rights, which posed problems for ArenaNet when Direct Song disappeared. Soule was also vehemently anti-piracy, likening it to the Holocaust, which understandably bothered some people. Direct Song's customer support was famous for being difficult to work with. This eventually led to a class action lawsuit, but it's not clear to me what happened as a result of that. And then there was the Kickstarter campaign. Like many of its era, a Kickstarter campaign to produce a symphony ended up not being so simple. He wanted $10,000. He got $121,000. Yet years later, he had not finished The Northerner. The campaign was shrouded in controversy, not just for being late, but the perception that Soule had used the money to fund an international vacation. It was more complicated than that, but again, the lack of transparency with both his financial supporters as well as the broader public did not help the situation. Plus, the direct song stuff was going on with Guild Wars 2 at the same time. When the sexual assault allegations came out, the label handling The Northerner dropped Soule as a consequence. His social media pages disappeared, and later his direct song, Bandcamp, and Patreon pages also disappeared. Which is a sad ending for someone with as many amazing soundtracks to his name as Jeremy Soule.
That fetching thief has been a stand-in for me. I can detail. Please. I fit. A caravan. I've got a plan of my own. Meet me here when you're done.
Hey, how's it going, guys? It's Nate here. And over the last half-decade or so on this channel, we have been investigating more Skyrim mysteries than there are tigers left in the real world. Seriously. We filtered through thousands of the most fascinating unexplained phenomenon in the Elder Scrolls universe. From the disappearance of the Dwemer to the mysterious symbols found on High Hrothgar, we've built an encyclopedia of bizarre items. A few months ago, in search of new ideas, I set about creating a giant list of every single mystery that's been featured on this channel before. And in doing so, realized
Raven Blackbriar, who herself has connections in the Empire as well as dangerous. Did you know that every questline in Skyrim points you at the main quest? Word walls are inexorably tied to the game's main quest as it's a new mechanic for the series. But before we get to that, we have to go back to the introduction. Now, a neatish thing about the introduction is how it approaches introducing the main quest. Rather than thrusting an amulet into the player's hands with instructions on where to go and what to do, all that happens is that Helgen gets destroyed. It's like a natural disaster, without demanding the player find some way to prevent this from happening again. That said, once you leave the Helgen cave, you are technically free, but I personally have never believed this argument. Hadvar or Ralof suggest going off on your own, but this is like saying you're free to do whatever in Oblivion because there's a single line in the journal entry saying that. Of course, Oblivion dumps you right out next to the Imperial City. In Skyrim, we're just in the middle of nowhere. To me, the first logical thing to do is to visit a merchant, which means going towards civilization, which means following Ralof or Hadvar. This is furthered by the fact that this is clearly the way you are being shepherded to go by Bethesda, considering this is the route that Todd Howard used as a demo to advertise the game, the location of the Guardian Stones, and the additional attention that went into Riverwood. The further down this track you go, the harder it is to ignore the main quest. If you go with Hadvar or Ralof to visit their family in Riverwood, their families will request you go to Whiterun to get Jarl Balgruuf to send guards to the settlement. Well, it would be rude to deny such a simple request, especially given how important it is. And when you do that, Balgruuf will then send you to his court wizard, giving you a quest to visit Bleak Falls Barrow. However, if you simply go to the Riverwood Trader in an attempt to ignore the main quest, you'll also be asked to retrieve the Golden Claw from Bleak Falls Barrow. Even if you ignore all that, should you ever do a Radiant bounty in Whiterun or have business with the Jarl, you'll be entered into the sequence that ends with you being sent to Bleak Falls Barrow. It is rather interesting contrasting how Skyrim tries to force the player into the main quest compared to past games. In Oblivion, it is obvious what the main quest is, and if you decide to ignore it, all you have to do is not enter Wayne Priory. Oblivion gates only start littering the countryside after you bring Martin to Joffrey. In Morrowind, Caius Casades will outright tell you to go get experience before giving you the second quest, recommending the Fighters and Mages Guild instead. Now, the ease of ignoring the main quest from a roleplay perspective is a whole other issue. After Helgen, the player won't see any further dragon attacks until you return to Whiterun's court wizard from Bleak Falls Barrow. So, if you have meta knowledge of the main quest, it's rather easy to avoid. However, it is impossible to engage with the new shout mechanics and avoid the main quest. This is because using shouts requires a resource that comes from dragons. This is unlike Oblivion Gates. Gates would give you sigil stones, which were one-time enchants of effects. However, you could still find enchanted gear or make it with soul gems. It wouldn't be as good, but it is good enough to avoid running Oblivion Gates. Now let's compare what you're missing out on if you decide to dodge the main quest. At Bleak Falls Barrow, you learn a word of unrelenting force. Your voice is raw power, pushing aside anything or anyone who stands in your path. If you do the companions, you learn a word of the shout to breathe fire. It's not as cool as it sounds, but your first time playing, you don't know that yet. From the College of Winterhold, you learn a word of ice form. Your Thuum freezes an opponent's solid. Later in the college and early in the Civil War, you learn words of the slow time shout. Again, sounds cool and like something you'd want to learn how to do. In the Thieves Guild, you learn a word of disarm, a unique ability you'll only unlock through perks at higher levels. From the Dark Brotherhood, you learn the word marked for death. Speak, and let your voice herald doom as an opponent's armor and life force are weakened. That's also not counting any of the shouts you learn from dungeons you are radiantly sent to or decide to go do on your own free time. Now you might say, well, the game doesn't tell you which quest you need to unlock the dragon shouts. It's true, it does just refer to them as shouts in the magic menu, except at the bottom it tells you how many dragon souls you don't have and need to unlock the shouts. Also, that's making a big assumption you've missed the marketing and didn't know that Skyrim was a game about killing dragons. It's pretty easy to assume that the early quests that have to do with getting help to protect Riverwood from dragons, and then the quest where you go looking for a way to fight dragons in Bleak Falls Barrow, is going to lead to us eventually fighting a dragon. This is all to highlight that Skyrim is a game where you are undeniably a chosen one, and where rejecting that mantle requires foresight of the game's events in a way that the others did not. According to Wikipedia, Skyrim is a role-playing game. That's hard to believe. While Elder Scrolls games have never really been big about player choice in the stories compared to other contemporary role-playing games, they could often rest on the laurels of giving the player near absolute freedom to create their own unique character. In fact, there is so much freedom in creating a character in an Elder Scrolls game that basic things like being a prisoner in Oblivion is a common point of contention. Compare that with something like Mass Effect or The Witcher, where Commander Shepard and Geralt, while being characters that you control and make choices for, are still firmly defined by the tracks of the intended story, Paragon or Renegade, or how hardline of a Witcher you really are. That said, Skyrim characters come predefined with a trait that you have to actively manipulate the game to avoid conforming to. You are a Dragonborn. It's not as restrictive as Fallout shackling family members to the player, and I can roll my eyes every time I learn a dragon shout my non-Dragonborn characters aren't supposed to be able to use. My issue is how hard the Dungeon Master's trying to railroad my story to conform with theirs, simply for the sake of incorporating their new homebrew rules. Balgruuf doesn't ask if the player wants to assist him further, he just assumes that somebody who survived Helgen and ran a message from Riverwood is automatically interested in going into a crypt. What are you going to do, just walk off on the Jarl? His bodyguard just drew a sword for arriving without an appointment. I don't know if that's a good idea. What else are you going to do, ignore Farengar's request? Well, that's more plausible, but it does feel rude ignoring Jarl Balin's requests. Plus, it's not that different from any of the other sellsword stuff the player does, so no reason to ignore it without meta knowledge of the consequences. I just want to get paid for slaying a giant and use the enchanting table. Out of Bleak Falls Barrow, we recover the Dragonstone, the significance of which we'll have to learn later, however. A dragon has attacked Whiterun's western watchtower. Balgruuf wants us and his bodyguard Irileth to take some guards out to the watchtower to go fight it. It's not known if it's actually possible, but the Jarl figures Irileth might be able to figure out something from the experience. It's rather interesting seeing Nords try to deal with a threat they aren't even certain can actually be stopped, and Irileth seems savvy to this, so she tries to use the Nords' bravado to motivate them in the fight. So begins the ramp up to our first dragon encounter. We saw what one could do to Helgen, now it's time to repay the favor. We see the dragon emerge from the mountains above, and dragons in Skyrim are something else entirely. See, when a dragon is defeated, we as Dragonborn are capable of killing them permanently by sucking out their soul. We then spend those souls to unlock dragon shouts. However, including the DLC shouts, there are 81 words of power in Skyrim. Some of them are taught to you as part of the main quest, but even being charitable, that's still, let's say, 50 words or 50 dragons to unlock all of them. Now, there are not enough scripted encounters or even dragon peaks to constitute 50 souls, so they also are random encounters. However, the problem is that very little ceremony can be created around an enemy that you are expected to fight 50 of. Part of whatever dragon fight comparison you want to make is usually going to be level design. You need to create environments that the encounter can work around. Otherwise, you have to create a dragon AI that has the flexibility to be able to fight in a variety of environments. In essence, the problem, as always, is quantity over quality. Take the Oblivion Gates. They're actually pretty cool dungeons the first time you do them. They're largely exterior cells, they have a strong artistic direction, they have a unique design compared to most Oblivion dungeons. The problem with the Oblivion Gates is that there are 60 of them in Cyrodiil. The novelty of their design is going to wear off really quick if the player is taking the time to actually do them. Dragons have that same problem. They're legitimately cool to fight the first time you do it, but the luster goes away once you realize Mimolnir is functionally identical to every other dragon encounter in the game. Literally what type of dragon he even is level scaled. He can be a normal dragon, a blood dragon, a frost dragon, etc. It all depends on you, the player, and how long you put off this fight. Let's start with the mechanics of a dragon encounter. They start off flying around, finding positions where they can hover and breathe fire or frost at the player. Sometimes they land on a perch and do this, sometimes they land on the ground. Note that while there are a couple dozen shouts in the game, dragons won't actually use anything other than the most basic of damage shouts. Some dragons apparently know Unrelenting Force, but I personally have never seen them use it. Dragons will not use Animal Allegiance to recruit allies, they won't become ethereal, disarm opponents, or slow time. In fact, despite the claim that dragons are all apparently sapient creatures with their own philosophies and intelligence, they actually behave just like wild animals. This includes them flying off to go kill random creatures in the wilderness. Outside of these scripted moments and quests, dragons will not communicate with anyone. They don't negotiate, they don't make demands of subservience, they don't even gloat. They also don't retreat, nor are they intelligent with what fights they pick. They don't strategically burn farms and minor settlements, they just sit on mountain peaks and occasionally fly off to go get killed. The smartest of the dragons were the ones that picked fights with the College of Winterhold, which they consistently lost even without my help. Even the town guard of Falkreath were capable of slaying dragons if one showed up during the changing of the guard. Once a dragon is at half health, they will land on the ground. At this point, it's basically over for them. Melee and magic characters can easily stunlock dragons to death, and archer characters have a big, easy target to hit. You would think that slaying dragons would be particularly difficult. Perhaps they even have a resistance to normal weapons due to their thick hides and tough scales, but no, base iron is capable of damaging a dragon because dragons are just flat pools of health that fly around. Once you've fought one dragon, you've fought them all. A simple place to start would be to make it so that dragons use more shouts as they level up. I would also create a couple AI packages for dragons that would vary their tactics. Some dragons would be like warriors, favoring ground combat and using elemental fury to augment their abilities. Other dragons would be like archers, using hit and run tactics with their shouts. And then rarely, you would encounter dragons capable of using magic, summoning Daedra and using a variety of magic spells in addition to their shouts. I would really sell the idea that the dragons are unique and have classes, just like the player. Oh wait. I would also make a pool of dragon names so each dragon is a named encounter, even if it's randomly pulled from a list of like 150 potential names. Just look at how randomly picking names for Uruks in the Middle-earth games works really well for emergent storytelling, and no, they didn't patent the idea of pulling names from a list. Funny thing is, as far as content goes, dragons appear to have the least amount of cut content. They were also a primary focus during pre-production. It's not that dragons were meant to be amazing encounters and Bethesda had to settle their ambitions against a cruel reality of the release date. This is how it's meant to be. This is intentional. It's been stated a big movie inspiration for dragons was the 2002 film Reign of Fire. In that movie, dragons emerge from hibernation, apparently going to sleep after wiping out the dinosaurs and all life on Earth. As you can guess, they do this not out of some intelligent desire to destroy things, but because they're wild animals who are hungry. They literally threaten their own extinction because of how stupid they are. This film recouped its costs, but it was hardly a blockbuster. It's not even really considered a cult classic. However, its inspirations when it comes to cinematic interpretations of dragons is undeniable, with Harry Potter, Game of Thrones, even the Hobbit movies using similar designs. Obviously, I have to point out that these are wyverns, not dragons, because there are some real nerds out there who would be upset if I didn't. I consider that observation uninteresting, however. I mean, look at the visual composition of Reign of Fire, how dark and gray everything is, and compare that with the standard edition of Skyrim. They even recreated a shot of the movie in the live-action trailer where the guy stands off against the dragon. I'm guessing that the team must have gone out to see the movie after Morrowind shipped, so there were some big positive associations at Bethesda, which is fine, I guess, but it really informs a big part of the issue here. The lore and the writers say the dragons are intelligent creatures, while the artists and designers were forced to watch Reign of Fire every week. The end result is this weird hybrid. There is actually a way for Bethesda to have their cake and eat it too. It's called Lesser Dragons. You already have this idea that souls equals intelligence in Elder Scrolls, so you could simply say that dragons with weak souls are like feral creatures that only answer to greater dragons, and the greater dragons are the intelligent ones who might have 3 dragons worth of souls or an entire shout. As it stands, however, Skyrim dragons are fairly lame. They're just flying death claws, or cliff racers with magic. Upon Mimolnir's defeat, we absorb his soul. Now, I need to get this off my chest. Todd Howard pulled a sneaky. During the gameplay demo, when he absorbs Mimolnir's soul, he quickly switches to the Firestorm spell. You can actually hear the hotkey going off. So he just makes grabbing the soul more epic than it actually is. Mind you, it's a cool effect, but really it's just kind of a lame party popper for the end of a lame dragon fight. The dragon's flesh melts off, including the scales. I was always confused how we recover the scales given the bodies burn up, or how dragon bone is an extremely valuable material, but the obvious dragon burial sites went unpilfered for thousands of years. The only use for these materials is weapons and armor. In the base game, it was actually just armor, with dragon scale being the best light armor and dragon bone being the second best heavy armor. Which is funny considering the Daedric smithing perk comes before the dragon smithing perk. Also, the Dragonbone weapons came with the Dawnguard DLC as post-launch content. I think getting these high-level materials pushes players to grind their smithing skill up more than anything else in the game. Dragon encounters are far more common than the chances of the player finding ebony or malachite, especially since vendors only sell those materials at higher level. Whereas Skyrim pushes you towards fighting your first dragon before level 10. So the guards are impressed with the whole soul absorption thing and will ask if you can do any dragon shouts. Of course you can. See, you can't get the Dragonstone without learning the first word of Unrelenting Force, and you can't fight Mimolnir without getting the Dragonstone, and the game will actually unlock the first word of Unrelenting Force for you, so whatever words you were hoping to learn like Slow Time or Ice Form is gonna have to wait, because the game really wants you to know the marketable one, Foos, from the trailer.
In their tongue, he is Dovahkiin, Dragonborn.
While the soldiers are impressed with our newfound abilities, Irilith is not.
I've been all across Tamriel. I've seen plenty of things just as outlandish as this.
What, like sword singing? The replacement for dragon shouts in Elder Scrolls 6? Irilith's a really interesting premise for a character. She's a worldly Dunmer assassin who shows an appropriate level of experience and skepticism. There's a whole story about how a woman like her became the Housecarl to Balgruuf that Skyrim doesn't really tell, because after this point she exits the stage. Compare that with Oblivion, where you meet Boris, Joffrey, and Martin all early and engage with them throughout the story. We've yet to meet a character as part of the main quest who is prevalent throughout, as doing the Dragon Rising quest enables the battle for Whiterun, meaning that Balgruuf at this point has to be flexible enough to get replaced. On our way back to Whiterun, we hear a loud shout from the heavens, and Balgruuf tells us that it's a summon from the Greybeards, and we cannot possibly ignore it. Yeah, thanks for sucking us into the vortex of the main quest and then giving us literal summons from the top of the world. At this point, Balgruuf will make us the Thane of Whiterun and give us a Housecarl named Lydia, who I promptly ignored. Her popularity is owed to her being a welfare hireling. I mean, it's not like most hirelings are particularly difficult to recruit, but you can do better than Lydia. Being Thane has no responsibilities and only 2 perks. You can get a bounty up to 2,000 gold forgiven once, and you're given permission to buy a home. I find this really amusing. By implication, I know it isn't necessarily true. Regardless, by implication, everyone who owns a home in Skyrim is a Thane. In addition, because murders are typically a bounty of 1040, you're given a one-time murder pass by being Thane. Thus, every homeowner in Skyrim is also potentially a murderer.
Congratulations.
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 Congratulations. Congratulations.
Congratulations.
Congratulations. Congratulations.
Congratulations.
Congratulations.
We've been summoned by the Greybeards, which are masters of the voice that live on top of the throat of the world. When Todd Howard said you could climb that mountain, the throat of the world was the mountain he was specifically pointing at.
Big epic things like mountains, you can walk to the top of that mountain, so...
It has 7,000 steps, or 700.
I have been promised 7,000 steps, and I'm going to count them. Yes. Our world artists are amazing. We have just an amazing team, and they put so much detail in the world. So they didn't blink when I said it must have 7,000 steps.
Now, the piece of lore the 7K comes from is the Pocket Guide to the Empire First Edition, which was a physical lore book that came with Redguard and was a collaborative effort between Michael Kirkbride and Kurt Coleman. However, the 3rd edition Pocket Guide that came with Morrowind did not corroborate this fact, probably for innocuous reasons. Unfortunately, Klimek had to open his mouth.
On your way up the 7,000 steps again, Klimek?
Trouble is, my legs aren't what they used to be, and climbing the 7,000 steps takes its toll. 7,000 steps indeed. Next time, they need to build it closer to the ground.
My view is, if you look at all the stuff we have in the world, 7,000 steps is not significantly, it's not that hard.
Now, some tricky math here says the mountain would have to be 9.5 times bigger to actually accommodate the full 7,000 steps. You could argue that maybe the 7,000 steps includes the climb up to Iverstead. I would argue that I have a 15-inch cock if you start measuring from my prostate. This is one of those issues of scale. Morrowind lowered the scaling of Elder Scrolls worlds, and this has posed issues ever since. It's a consequence of handcrafted world design, but unfortunately Bethesda's not taken the opportunity to increase the scale of their worlds. Now, on the one hand, this means the worlds are tightly packed full of content. On the other, when Bethesda needs to show the scale of something, they usually fall short as a consequence. Post-Red Year, the Throat of the World is the undisputed tallest mountain in Tamriel. There's a lot of napkin math around this, since it's hard to translate the size of the in-game mountain to real-world units. Since people like to pretend to climb Mount Everest on their stairs, there are decent numbers of step counts required. For Everest, this is around 17,000 steps. If you try to find a more comparable mountain, the Throat of the World wouldn't even place in the top 100 tallest mountains on Earth. Which is a shame. You would think in a fantasy setting that the Throat of the World would be absurdly tall, putting real-world mountains to shame. But I'm guessing that 7,000 just sounded like a good number for a lore tidbit back in the 90s that Bethesda wasn't ever certain would actually come back to haunt them. Remember that when Redguard was made, Elder Scrolls was still supposed to be procedurally generated, and Morrowind was actually going to be a hybrid of handcrafted and procedurally generated world design. Now, as lamentable as this is, it is again Bethesda that intentionally draws attention to the 7K figure. It would be one thing if lore nerds were complaining about some obscure 15-year-old factoid that wasn't actually in the games, but you dug this hole when you drew attention to it. That said, there is an interesting side effect to all this. Climbing the Throat of the World is still the Skyrim equivalent of a Mount Everest trip. Iverstead is a settlement practically built around the tourism industry, and the only thing missing are the Sherpas offering to help people take trips up the mountain. Klimek is an Iverstead man who actually delivers supplies up to the monastery at the top, meaning he routinely makes the trip. You can also encounter other people on the way up the mountain. This is all to say, the mountain is actually approachable enough that it makes sense people treat it in this manner. Now, once I heard from a random person in a live stream that air doesn't exist in Elder Scrolls. I'm not sure how true that is, but it was such a weird thing to say that it's stuck with me ever since. Anyways, I bring that up because part of a mountain being an approachable climb is the ability to breathe. Less a deal for the people that live here and more a deal for us lowlanders who might not be acclimated or even have the ability to survive in low oxygen environments. However, ballpark estimates seem to place High Hrothgar, where the Greybeards live at about the same height as the tallest human settlement on Earth, or about 5.1 kilometers above sea level. Anyways, I spent too long reading about mountains to say, I don't think Bethesda did a very good job portraying how much of an ordeal this would be. If this were a movie, the climb to High Hrothgar would be symbolic of the main character's struggle with the call to action. Too often is the struggle portrayed as a monster, or a man, or society. Not often enough is the simple act of survival utilized. It's called man against nature. It's sort of like how in The Last Jedi, Rey's struggle should have been figuring out how to survive falling in a deep pool of water despite never having the opportunity to learn how to swim. Of course, there is a big obstacle on this journey that tends to trip people up. Remember how Bethesda pushes people down the main quest line? Well, this is a common enough trend that we have evidence because the UESP article for this quest includes multiple strategies for contending with a frost troll on the path. Ah yes, the Great Filter. Step aside, Bridge Wizard, you've been replaced by a frost troll. I will remind you that reaching this point in the questline required us to slay a dragon, but the filter that actually stops people is a fucking snow ape. As you climb the mountain, you'll encounter some etched tablets. There are 10 of them, and they include a really basic summary of relevant lore. Dragons used to run things, then men showed up and dragons still ran things. Kine, or Kinnereth, asked Parthenax to teach men how to use the voice, and this led to a war between dragons and men. The men won against the dragons, then used the voice to found their own empire. However, the voice was defeated at Red Mountain. Jurgen Windcaller took this opportunity to meditate on their defeat, and came up with a philosophy and built High Hrothgar. The Greybeards stayed in meditative silence until Tiber Septim, who they tutored and named Dovahkiin. The final tablet lays out the principle of the Greybeards: only use the power of the voice in times of need. However, chances are you, yes, you, didn't find all the tablets or couldn't be bothered to actually read them. That's okay though, most of this information will be elaborated upon later. So we reach High Hrothgar and drop off Klimek's supplies, which is funny considering most people are only going to be here as part of the main quest, so like, just hand deliver them. Also, funny thing, you can take the supplies after dropping them off, and they're like the paintbrushes from Oblivion, no gravity. I did not find a good use for this quirk. We meet with the Greybeards, whose voices are so powerful that they can't hold casual conversation. Arngeir, however, can speak without causing an avalanche that destroys Riverwood and Ivarstead, so he represents the Greybeards. Funny thing, I always thought Arngeir was the youngest Greybeard, so his voice wasn't fully developed yet. My evidence was visual. Arngeir has this short little bush tied, while the other Greybeards have full, lengthy beards. Also, Ulfric Stormcloak trained to be a Greybeard and his voice doesn't destroy everything, so I just assumed your voice would get more powerful the longer you trained. However, it's actually the opposite. Arngeir is the Grandmaster, and the only reason he can speak normally is because he's trained hard enough to control his voice. I think this has to do with Bethesda's leadership fetish. We are meeting the Greybeards, so of course we have to speak to their leader. Wouldn't it be better if we were speaking with the least experienced Greybeard, but he was still super wise? This brings up an unfortunate question about how exactly this order has managed to survive for thousands of years. The Greybeards, I have an issue with that name, there are only 4 of them, and they're all old men. Technically their name is the Masters of the Voice, but everyone calls them Greybeards because calling them tongues would have led to ceaseless cunnilingus jokes on r/Skyrim. Okay, so they have a unifying phenotypical descriptor, but how exactly do people actually join this order? Ulfric says he was chosen when he was a lad and then trained with them for 10 years. Given that Ulfric is sporting a dirty blonde goatee, it's fair to say he wasn't a Greybeard. Also, how exactly did they choose Ulfric? They apparently don't get out much, so it's not like Ulfric was a young man living in the Palace of Kings, and then one day a Greybeard showed up to take him to Hogwarts. If anything, it seems more likely that the Greybeard recruitment would be the people who journey up to High Hrothgar. Klimek, for instance, seems like a perfect candidate after years of making the trip and would be allowed into the monastery to begin training. I'm just saying, it seems to me like someone isn't thinking about the logistics here. If it takes years to develop a mastery of the voice, then it seems like the stability of the order would be at extreme risk if only 2 of the Greybeards were to die over the course of 5 years. All you have to do to account for this is to make one of the nonverbal Greybeards an obviously younger man, but of course that would betray the premise of them being Greybeards. Of course they have to all be old men, the scene demands it. A notable thing, Arngeir is the first character in the main quest to recur throughout the quest line. It took this long to introduce a secondary character into the storyline. I mean, I guess the big black bad dragon was at the start of the game, but all he did was break things. Hard to say there was a character introduction in that scene. Arngeir is a mentor character who helps teach the player about the way of the voice, and establishes a decent chunk of lore, like the fact that the voice is also known as the Thu'um. Now to contrast this, Oblivion didn't really have mentor characters in the main quest line. The closest was Joffrey, and even then he was more like our boss than a mentor. Caius Casades in Morrowind was also mostly a boss, although he did offer advice for dealing with the political aspects. Nabani Mesa, the wise woman of the Ursulaku tribe, however, was definitely a spiritual mentor for the player in Morrowind. So Skyrim is shaking things up a bit by making us a free agent for a few quests and then sending us to go visit some monks. That said, Morrowind and Oblivion both did have recurring characters introduced early and throughout their plots. Not to worry though, they'll send us to a dungeon right quick. But first, 2 gifts. We learn the second word of Unrelenting Force, making it stagger enemies more. They also teach us a word of Whirlwind Sprint. This shout acts like a dash, providing some interesting mobility options. However, the extent of Bethesda's creativity with this new ability is going to be very quickly fulfilled. The Greybeards want to test us, as though climbing the mountain wasn't enough of an ordeal. It is apparently customary to receive the horn of Jurgen Windcaller, the founder of their order, which is currently located in the ruins of Ustengrav. I'm not really sure why he was buried out in the swamp by the ocean a third of the way across the continent, when the sum of his life's work was on top of the tallest mountain in the world. The ruin is currently occupied by necromancers who have been excavating and come into conflict with the native Draugr. I don't really have much to say about Ustengrav. If you've been following just the main quest, then I guess the moment when you first enter the giant cavern area might be impressive, compared to the last time you entered a giant cavern area at Bleak Falls Barrow that was like half as big. However, this becomes such a trope not just in the Bethesda content but even Creation Club content that I'm numb to it. Skyrim's canon ending has to include a series of massive earthquakes due to how many cavitations in the earth there are. I'm also surprised it isn't more common to find skeletons at the bottom of these giant pits. Yeah, that source of light up there has to come from somewhere. Oh wait, that's actually a plot point in a DLC quest. Still, the meme of the underground cavern is only special when done sparingly. There is a jumping puzzle here that asks you to make use of your whirlwind sprint shout, complete with a chest at the end to reward you. I don't remember what was in the chest because of how minor it was. I think it was around 10 gold and a minor healing potion on my level 60 character. And there's this portcullis system that requires you to use whirlwind sprint to pass. I've tested it and it seems pretty foolproof. You would need some serious fortify speed to get past it without knowing the shout. And that's it. What is it? Oh yeah, remember when I said that Bethesda's creativity would be quickly fulfilled? Well, congratulations, their creativity has been fulfilled. No, I'm not kidding. If you've played a lot of platformers, then you already know that the forward dash ability tends to unlock a lot of creative potential from the designers. There's just so much you can do when you know the player can perform a forward dash. For instance, that short jumping puzzle is one such thing. You could have gaps that only players with this shout could clear. In a typical game, unlocking Whirlwind Sprint would mean that every main quest dungeon following Ustengrav could make use of that ability. It's very common in games to give the players new mobility options and then design hidden rewards for using them. However, in a typical Bethesda moment, I can only imagine they were terrified of the idea of players encountering something they couldn't do without the shout before they got it, and so dictated that the shout could never be used outside of the one instance where it was guaranteed to be known. As though some percentage of the players would somehow be able to skip this quest and complete the rest of the quest line without knowing Whirlwind Sprint. While I understand not wanting to impose playstyles on characters, it's fair to say that most people doing the main quest here are going to be fine with you actually utilizing dragon shouts, especially if it's for purposes that make the game more creatively interesting. Because Whirlwind Sprint otherwise has little use outside of these 7 hidden areas that can only be accessed with this shout. It obviously shares a cooldown with other, more useful shouts, so the combat utility of being able to close gaps isn't really as useful as being able to ragdoll, paralyze, or disarm opponents. Especially if you factor in the apathy threshold problem. The most consistent use I found in the entire game was swinging blade hallways, something that was already easy to bypass and survive without the shout, since it shows up even in Bleak Falls Barrow. So now we're at the bottom of Ustengrav at the tomb of Jurgen Windcaller, except betrayal! The horn is gone. Unsurprising, really. I can only imagine how many future prophecies I've fucked over due to my own tomb raiding. Actually, whoever took it left a note asking we meet with them. This is, by my estimation, physically impossible, meaning that I am more than interested to meet the person responsible, as they will likely be a very powerful wizard. Actually, it's just a normal innkeeper.
The Greybeards seem to think you're the Dragonborn. I hope they're right.
The Greybeards are right. I am the Dragonborn.
I hope so, but you'll forgive me if I don't assume that something's true just because the Greybeards say so. I just handed you the horn of Jurgen Windcaller. Does that make me Dragonborn too?
Well, that's a great fucking question, isn't it, Delphine? How exactly did you accomplish this task? First of all, the necromancers won't actually complete their excavation and open up the ruins until conveniently right before we are to look for the horn. This includes the back door for the dungeon. If you come here before that point in the main questline, this hallway is blocked off. So Delphine has a very tight window of opportunity to actually steal the horn, leading to the second problem. How did she get past the Whirlwind Sprint challenge? I asked my livestream chat for ideas, and the best they offered was that she hired mercenaries to set off the sensors and then ran through. However, Delphine doesn't seem like the type to involve anyone she absolutely doesn't have to, so she would have had to run up against this problem first, and then left to go hire mercenaries, and then come back, eating up that precious little time she has before we get there. And consider this, Delphine's actually the woman we saw talking to Farengar after we returned from Bleak Falls Barrow. In fact, the reason we went to Bleak Falls Barrow was because Delphine was using Farengar to get sellswords sent to the dungeon to look for the Dragonstone. If Delphine isn't above just hiring mercenaries to do it, then why didn't she just hire her own sellswords to go get the Dragonstone? Seems like a risk that might blow her cover to involve Farengar just for the sake of saving drakes on mercs. That is, of course, assuming she had nothing to do with one of her fellow Riverwood business owners getting robbed for the Golden Claw that was essential to getting the Dragonstone. But the game never actually implies Delphine had anything to do with that, just that it was weird that bandits stole the one singular item from the shop. Anyways, my point is, given the type of person Delphine is, it's fair to say that she was the only person she would be willing to involve in this operation, which returns us to the original question of how she accomplished this. She only knows 2 restoration spells, nothing that would be feasible for trying to do this like conjuring a minion or reanimating a body to run past the sensors. And Skyrim doesn't do 10-foot poles, although I think you'd probably need like a 50-foot pole for this one. So the only thing I can think of is that she shadowed us and then somehow got ahead of us to steal the horn without setting off the water feature, or breaking the spider web, and then escaped without... No, I'm not really buying this one either. It's not impossible, since the Whirlwind Sprint Challenge stays open after you get past it, but that would mean that Delphine is literally one of the best thieves, not just in Skyrim, but literally the entire setting. Not even the Oblivion Thieves Guild character could lay a finger on just how stealthy Delphine would have to be, and that guy stole an Elder Scroll from the Imperial Palace.
Is she clairvoyant? I mean, that would make sense. She was apparently pretty clairvoyant last time.
Well, that's a great question. It is an attainable power now, although I doubt it would be of much help to her. I don't think the power of clairvoyance can be used to achieve things that are physically impossible. So, yeah, we'll just classify Delphine getting the horn as impossible. Now let's talk about the why. Well, as Delphine puts it,
when you showed up here, I knew you were the one the Greybeard sent, and not some Thalmor plant.
in fairness, I know that tying everything to the Thalmor is old hat at this point in the video, but Delphine is kind of the OG Q-boomer conspiracy theorist accusing every unexplained plot point of being involved with the Thalmor, so she stole the horn as a test of whether or not we're a Thalmor trap. Wait, I worded that wrong. Okay, so I'm kind of confused. What's the trap aspect of this situation? Assume the implication, based on the other stuff about her character, is that she's absolutely paranoid enough to assume the Thalmor would fake the Greybeard summons in the story of someone slaying a dragon just to smoke out a Blades agent. However, if that were true, then would the Thalmor even include the horn in their psyop? She would steal the horn and then the Thalmor agents would never show up because the trap would be her contacting the fake Dragonborn first anyways. She says she took the horn because she knew that's what the Greybeards would send the Dragonborn to retrieve if they thought we were legit, and if we showed up here, then we're the real deal and not a Thalmor agent. Okay, wait. So you think that you, and only you, are the only non-Dragonborn that could successfully know about and reach the horn? What if there was a person in Skyrim that was available for hire and could unlock literally any door? Oh wait, he exists. His name was Mercer Frey. Whatever trick you used, Delphine, would absolutely be available to the Thalmor, especially since they have way more resources than you. Also, you based all this on a really faulty assumption. What signal are you going to get if the fake Dragonborn can't reach the horn versus a real Dragonborn reaching the horn, but the node is missing because it blew away or something? So then we would return to High Hrothgar without the horn. I mean, in a realistic situation, I can imagine the Greybeards accepting that it's within the realm of possibility that the horn had been stolen since the last time they sent someone to Ustengrav 600 years ago. Especially if it is supposed to be physically possible to steal the horn without being the Dragonborn. It could have been weeks before Delphine realized that our horn test failed simply because the breeze of us entering the room blew the note away. All we really have to do is describe Jurgen Windcaller's tomb for the Greybeards to accept that we completed the test of Ustengrav and can continue with our training. Obviously, this isn't possible in the game. You can't mention to Arngeir that the horn was stolen. Even Oblivion had a line of dialogue here and there for situations like this. Arngeir should say that whoever stole the horn would obviously be very dangerous and that we should be careful. However, Bethesda correctly assumes that most players are just going to follow the quest marker straight to Delphine, so why bother? Also, how funny would it be if Delphine had a different greeting if the player was a high elf and walked in wearing full Thalmor equipment? Delphine is a commonly hated character, and for good reason.
I'll explain what I want when I want. Got it? You'd already be dead if I didn't like the look of you when you walked in here.
Yeah, extreme doubt. The character she said this to had such a terrifying presence that the ghosts of ancient warriors were scared of her. Delphine, you're going up against a character who can turn her enemies into mush just by standing within 100 feet of them. Delphine's character just starts off poorly and doesn't get any better throughout the questline. She did give us the horn back, as though Bethesda were worried that their fans would complain if they walked out of a dungeon empty-handed. I guess they would, but there was also a boss chest. So we head back up to High Hrothgar, which is an issue because of fast travel. Like, there's a world of difference between skipping the on-foot journey between Whiterun and Markarth and skipping the on-foot journey up the tallest mountain in the world. Bethesda's logic is that anyone who's ever been to the top of Mount Everest can just fast travel there now. I want to introduce you to an artifact from Morrowind, the Boots of the Apostle. What's significant about them is that they are an artifact that was actually created by the Greybeards and gifted to Talos Stormcrown for exactly this purpose. They gave the wearer the ability to fly upon the clouds, which he used to descend from High Hrothgar. And despite all the Morrowind nostalgia bait in the Creation Club, nobody seemed to remember this item. I guess it's because it makes you levitate, but it wouldn't be the first time a creation changed an item's enchantment just to fit inside of Skyrim. Arngeir thanks us for the horn, and the Greybeards blow some words at us, basically saying that we're now recognized as the Dragonborn, Stormcrown, and Ysmir. Basically, just a hero of the North. We learn the third word of Unrelenting Force,
Fusroda, Those are the three.
Fusrada.
And you gotta yell it. And it stands for force, balance, push in the dragon language.
Making it a full power game ender for many NPCs, and that's it. The Greybeards have nothing else for us because now we're supposed to go do Delphine's quests instead. It is an unenviable problem. Even if the Greybeards gave us another task and it was like competing quest lines, there is eventually a point where we would run out of Greybeards quests and then would have to do the cuck walk of shame back to Delphine's Inn. The problem is that Delphine, in addition to being a mind-breaking wizard, is just a toxic person in general. I think the game is trying to draw attention to this. However, I'd hate to spoil the fact that Delphine does not undergo any redemption arc. Actually, that's not much of a spoiler. Again, Delphine's bad attitude is pretty well known and complained about. Delphine is a member of the Blades, and historically the Blades have been pretty good characters. That doesn't mean the Blades always have to be nice. I'm thinking of Glenroy, who suggested that the Blades just murder the player character in Oblivion simply for being in the wrong place. It does, however, kind of stand out that in a game full of bitchy female characters that the primary female character in the main quest also behaves in that manner, while her male counterparts, both in the other games and in this one, are far more polite and reasonable. To jump ahead a bit, later we'll meet Esbern, who's been living in far worse conditions than Delphine, but is just a polite old man. He's the sweetest thing. You can write off Delphine's flaws as consequences of her paranoia, but at least she got to live on the surface, be an innkeeper, and actually accomplish things in her fight against the Thalmor. Delphine wants us to prove that we're the Dragonborn. Specifically, she wants to prove that we're capable of slaying dragons. I can't help but feel all of this could have been prevented if Delphine had decided to just observe the Western Watchtower confrontation from a distance. It wouldn't have even been that far out of her way on her trip back to Riverwood. And it's not implausible, one of her primary reasons for her actions is the return of the dragons, so you would think Delphine might watch how humans fight Mimolnir in order to understand what humanity could do better. And even then, we've already proven we're the Dragonborn, and I'm sure she would have heard through Farengar that a dragon soul was indeed observed being absorbed at the Western Watchtower. But Delphine wants to be super sure, so she asks us to meet her at Kynesgrove. She's used the Dragonstone we recovered earlier in the questline to create a map of dragon resurrections, because she's somehow had the time to visit all the dragon burial sites in the eastern part of Riften, in addition to everything else that she's done, in the time between getting the Dragonstone and this meeting. Her theory is that the dragons are coming back from the dead, so she wants to observe this process, and then she wants us to prove that we can absorb souls. So at least there's one aspect of this quest that's going to reveal new information. Funny thing, she actually has dialogue if you physically travel with her where she'll comment on various landmarks you pass on the way to Kynesgrove. It's neat but easy to miss because of fast travel. Kynesgrove is a tiny mining settlement near Windhelm, and sure enough, the big black bad dragon is there, being menacing. Actually, he's up at the old Dragon Mount. Wait, you guys know that's what that is? Do you realize how much money you'd make from digging that sucker up and selling the remains? Not like this mining town would have excavation equipment, or laborers. Sure enough, the Black Dragon is resurrecting a dead dragon, returning it to life. I think this is where the game first introduces the Black Dragon's name, although you have to pay attention to and understand what the dragons are saying to each other. Also, it's in the subtitles, which I always hate. Skyrim's capable of masking a character's name for dramatic reveals like in Dawnguard, but if you have the subtitles on, and you really should in Skyrim, then it's revealed that the dragon's name is Alduin. Now, how significant a reveal this is depends on how much you know about the lore, so not really, and his significance will be explained later. This is also the first instance where players will really see dragons communicating. I mean, Mimolnir was supposed to say stuff, but only if you have the unofficial patch or another language installed. Seriously, that seems like an important scene for the dragons for Bethesda after 10 years to still have not fixed. This isn't like Oblivion where Bethesda stopped patching the game after a couple years. They literally sold a new version of Skyrim in the current decade. You're telling me you can add a no-shit Oblivion gate to Skyrim but not patch this? Alduin's all, you call yourself Dragonborn, but you don't know our language. And I'm all, yeah, well, that's what other people have been calling me because they haven't recognized me as the Emperor of Tamriel yet. At the end of our short dialogue, can't even really call it a dialogue if we don't say anything back, Alduin leaves and we're forced to fight Saloknir, which is probably the only time I'm ever going to deem to mention this dragon as he is a literal expendable pushover. I don't know why Alduin didn't take the opportunity to just kill us. I guess he has better things to do. I mean, he probably knows the stakes, that the gods are making new Dragonborn. He doesn't necessarily know that we're the only one. He might figure that it's too dangerous to justify taking us on and that he'd be better spent going off and resurrecting other dragons. My real issue is that the guy he leaves to fight us is just a normal dragon. Mimolnir was also just a normal dragon, but he was the first one you'll fight. This is an opportunity to escalate the powers of the dragons to match our own raised abilities. Except for a problem, Our only new abilities since fighting the last mandatory dragon encounter are an upgraded Unrelenting Force, Whirlwind Sprint, and if you found it, become ethereal. Unrelenting Force is the primary ability of the game that was all over the marketing material, but it isn't really that useful for fighting dragons like the trailer would imply. In reality, our dragon shouts have not meaningfully advanced, so this dragon also doesn't advance. It's literally the same encounter, and the only real difference is that there's less expendable guards to help us do damage. With the dragon soul absorbed, Delphine admits that she owes us some information. She reveals that she is a surviving member of the Blades, which were wiped out after the Great War. She doesn't really know much about the dragons, which is obvious, and she assumes that the Thalmor are responsible for their return. It's weird that Delphine assumes that some mortal organization is involved, and not Alduin himself. She literally observed them having a vocal conversation, including parts in a language that she does understand, and all of the lore that she has read is likely told her that the dragons are supposed to be intelligent creatures. Again, this is, I think, supposed to be showcasing how Delphine's mindset is compromised by her paranoia involving the Thalmor, that she's intentionally missing the bigger picture because she's already built up this idea in her head that her hated enemies are the ones behind it all. It's obvious that they're trying to do something with the character, but failing at it because her arc is just going to be replacing her paranoia of the Thalmor with paranoia of the dragons. She figures the next step is going to be trying to find whatever information the Thalmor has on the dragons by infiltrating their embassy and base of operations. Her idea is to have us infiltrate the embassy during a party where Skyrim's nobility and Empire supporters are invited to make friends with the Thalmor. We meet with a contact named Malborn who has us given whatever equipment we absolutely need, although I'm not entirely certain there's actually a limit to how much gear you can give him. This is reminiscent of the Mythic Dawn-based quest from Oblivion, which I noted at the time. You have a short section where you're deprived of equipment. However, Bethesda isn't really brave enough to run with this sequence or the potential that they've just created, and will give your stuff right back to you before you even have to fight anything. That leaves the party sequence, and boy is it kind of sad. I guess if you've never actually been to a party, you might accept that this is how they are. Seriously, this is the best the second biggest power on Tamriel can do for us. It sucks so much that barely anybody's here. There's just a random list of people who may or may not show up. But the end result is that usually it's like 4 people. Hell, the embassy is actually just a copy of Solitude architecture, so rather than taking the opportunity to show us how the High Elves prefer to build structures, we just get reused room assets from the Nords. The one party guest consistent between all playthroughs is Razalin. Since Malborn says we need a distraction to slip out, Raz ends up serving as a route of last resort. The problem really isn't that the route of last resort exists, by nature it has to. Without a single final possible route, some saves would get soft-locked at the party. The real problem is that Razalin's distraction is the same as all the others. You do him a favor and then he causes a scene. Every other potential guest is functionally identical mechanically, assuming you have a positive relationship with them. There is some small amount of effort on display here with a little bit of repeated dialogue in each encounter. Balgruuf, who only appears after the battle for Whiterun, frames Razalin as being a Stormcloak supporter. Elisif, who appears if you do her favor, will accuse Razalin of indecency. Erikr, our Thieves Guild contact in Solitude, causes a scene with one of the servant girls, one of the ways in which can potentially end up with her being sent to the torture room in the basement. General Tullius can be here if we've delivered the message to Whiterun and there currently isn't an active civil war battle. Eadgrod Ravencrone, Jarl of Morthal, will be at the party if Hjalmarch is Imperial controlled and you aren't doing her Thane quest, so you'll usually see her at this party. If you've done the main side quest in Morthal, then Eadgrod will pretend to have visions of Razalin with snakes behind his eyes. Igmund, Jarl of Markarth, actually has the same dialogue as Balgruuf, accusing Razalin of being a Stormcloak. Kind of weird, but okay. Maven Blackbriar will accuse Razalin of an indecent proposal. Undalamar, a Thalmor justiciar from Markarth, will accuse Razalin of disrespecting the Thalmor. This one's interesting. To actually see it, you have to complete Undalamar's quest, which is an investigation into illegal Talos worship. So it's actually interesting that in turn you can leverage that into earning a favor that generally ends poorly for the Thalmor involved. That's actually probably the only reason they didn't cut it, since I doubt Bethesda wants to have a single random side quest where you report some guy to the state police. This particular side quest has a lot of potential. Undalamar's not essential, meaning that if you decide to spare Ogmund, the Talos worshipper, you can either choose to not complete the quest, kill Undalamar, or bring the city under Stormcloak control. Orthus Indario is the East Empire Company representative in Windhelm, a character with a side quest I'd never heard of. Orthus actually knows Razalin from work and can accuse him of insulting the ambassador, although again this results in the same basic dialogue. 4 lines unique to the characters, 4 lines reused for every scenario. Proventus Avenici can show up, but he doesn't do anything, as per usual for him. Sidgeir, Jarl of Falkreath, has the same exact dialogue as Igmund and Balgruuf, which Skyrim has this issue with the Jarls where they all feel like copy-pastes of each other because they literally share the same exact dialogue when you become Thane, to the point of at least 2/3 of them saying, "Congratulations." Vittoria Vici can also show up, although her favor is the spiced wine quest that I doubt too many people have done considering that whole wedding thing. Anyways, now that I've explained how every single character in this scene exposes Rassilon as a degenerate, we need a good point of comparison. The first should be Lady Boyle's last party from Dishonored. Superficially, we can say that this is an excellent party. It's actually a display of wealth, contrasting with the apocalypse going on outside. It takes place in a spacious area and has many different party guests, hosts, servants, and guards. Now, obviously, the objectives are different. In Skyrim, we're trying to cause a scene to sneak out of the party, while in Dishonored, we're trying to identify which of the 3 costumed Boiled sisters is our target and eliminate them. Dishonored's trick is to lean into its mechanics for this. If you decide to sneak upstairs, then many of your innate powers can be utilized for exactly this purpose in a multitude of ways. The Dragonborn doesn't really have that option because most of our acquired abilities are just for combat. Even then, the playground is so small that even with Dishonored's power set, I would probably have a hard time doing this mission. Another good one to discuss would be the mission to infiltrate the Detroit police station in Deus Ex Human Revolution. Some of your options involve dialogue, talking your way into the morgue, while the player also has plenty of other ways to sneak into the building, utilizing a variety of potential augments. Again, this is mostly just the game relying on mechanics that aren't just overt combat mechanics. We do know that Skyrim has some shouts for non-combat applications, like throw voice. However, if you're the person who went straight from Helgen down every main quest to this point, then we can only assume you know Unrelenting Force and Whirlwind Sprint. Those could make a scene, however the goal isn't for us to be the center of it. So, we can conclude, either we need a foundational level rework, major changes to the shout system to add more non-combat mechanics, or changes to the dialogue system to provide more depth. Yeah, I'm not liking my odds here. So in Oblivion, when we were trying to retrieve the amulet, we got put through initiation for the Mythic Dawn, which involved us sacrificing this poor little lizard. Hey, it's a choice. If we're the ultimate badass hero, let's fight for his right to live. If we aren't confident in taking on a whole room of Mythic Dawn without our equipment, we can perform the sacrifice to further infiltrate the cult. And that was Oblivion. I think the problem starts with the assumption that this is literally the only way to infiltrate the embassy. Delphine may potentially be speaking to a Dragonborn who is already a master infiltrator for the Thieves Guild, or who has successfully managed to assassinate the Emperor. You can tell the differences in design philosophy. In Morrowind and even Oblivion's main quest to some extent, you do a variety of missions that involve combat and stealth. However, it was not balanced around the assumption that players had only done the main quest up to that point. If you were a stealth character, then the stealth missions were the opportunity to let your skill set shine. If you were a combat character, then the combat missions were your opportunity to do better than the other playstyles. Even magic had moments to hold an advantage. Rather than the main quest being for all playstyles, it's for every playstyle. The difference is that rather than having a stealth mission to infiltrate the embassy that stealth players would excel at, we instead get a heavily scripted sequence on the off chance that some players might get excluded. The sad part is that it later turns into a stealth sequence. I mean, you could just slaughter your way through the embassy, proving Delphine wrong in the process.
So that's your plan, huh? Even if you could survive, by the time you got inside, whatever documents they had would be long gone. We're there for information, remember? Trust me, I've been doing this for a long time. My way is better.
Well, I survived, and the documents are still here. I guess if they had just one more minute, they might have destroyed the documents, but that's still just sad no matter how you look at it. If there are no consequences for just cutting a swath through the Thalmor, then the party sequence is pointless. Imagine for a moment that the party was just one way of getting inside the embassy. You simply present your invitation at the gate and are let in. I think Bethesda didn't do that because they were worried that if players gave their gear to Malborn, that they would potentially be unable to reach the embassy due to getting killed, hence why we're instead given a cart ride straight into the inside of the compound from the city. My big idea is a ledge. It's obviously not close enough for anyone to jump inside, but hey, maybe if we had some kind of dragon shout that propels you forward through the air. The exterior guards have to rotate shifts at some point so stealthy infiltrators could slip in through the gate, and actually have consequences for failure. This might not work very well if it's just player detected, documents destroyed, but maybe have like a strike system. I mean, the Thalmor aren't going to burn all their dossiers just because some snowman chucked a rock at the wall. I'm sure the Thalmor embassy gets attacked every week by some overzealous Nord. Once we're out of the party, Malborn guides us through the kitchen and returns our equipment. There is some interesting stuff here if you decide to stealth it.
Good luck. Did you see those robes
You're on your own
this
now.
morning? Who are they with? More of the emissaries' treaty enforcers? No, they're high mages, just in from Alinor. I guess herself is finally getting worried about all the dragon attacks. Ah, good. I've been wondering how we were supposed to defend this place from a dragon. If a dragon does show up, maybe we'll get lucky, and it will eat the mages first. Might give us enough time to kill it. Ha! I'd like to see those arrogant bastards taken down a notch. Always looking down their noses at us lowly foot sloggers.
This is one of my favorite background dialogues in Skyrim. It's actually refreshing to have a moment of humanization for the Altmer. It's obviously a mixed bag since we haven't gotten to the torture room yet, but it's nice to know that the Thalmor aren't all hyper-evil caricatures. That said, I don't think there are any High Elves in Skyrim who politically support the Thalmor that aren't wearing their war gear. I can easily imagine Imperial soldiers or Stormcloaks having this exact same conversation about the arrival of their own battle mages. I believe this is supposed to hint to the player that a nearby set of Thalmor robes could be used to fool the guards. However, due to a bug, the base robes won't work and only the hooded robes, which either have to be looted off a wizard or smuggled in. Now, that actually makes sense. After all, compare the hooded version versus unhooded robes, and tell me which ones you think would be more effective for masking the fact that we aren't an Altmer. I think the unofficial patch actually makes the wrong correction here. Rather than making it so all robes work in addition to elven armor, which feels like a stretch to me, it would be much simpler to simply replace the 3 unhooded robes with the hooded version because, you know, it's a better disguise. The bug actually exposed a way to make the sequence better. Another thing is that this is one of those few instances where racial choice can be important. If the player is an Altmer or Bosmer, then guards won't question you, although they will comment that Bosmer players are pretty short. If you're a beast race, then guards will immediately call you out due to your tail. And if you are any of the other races, you have to keep your distance from the guards. There's actually some thought put into this sequence, only for most players to miss it because of a bug, and it's like very simple to fix.
Okay. There's a lot of resources on the internet to fix shit like this. Why aren't these people looking into it?
You would think that somebody at Bethesda would be upset that their little stealth sequence that they worked on doesn't work and would have done the most basic thing of correcting this issue by switching out which set of robes spawn. Seriously, it's one thing for there to still be physics glitches in the game. I'm sure those issues are not easy to fix. It's another when quests are broken in such a way that content is missing. It's like with Mimolnir's lines. Someone took the time to write those and someone else took the time to record them and someone had to implement them. But all that work is wasted. You can overhear a conversation between a justiciar and a man named Gisser, who reveals that he is an informant who has sold out another man. Unfortunately, this is where this character originates from. What I mean is that Gisser is not an existing character in the world. When the Sixth House began controlling the Sleepers, this manifested in commoners you would often pass in the streets suddenly being hostile towards you. But they won't utilize Gisser as a homeless man in Riften that you could potentially meet before this point. We grab some dossiers that I'll discuss later and head into the torture room where the man Gisser sold out is currently being tortured for information. We can either free him or steal a dossier with the relevant information. At this point, Malborn is supposed to be brought out, revealing that the Thalmor are aware of our presence. However, on one playthrough this didn't trigger correctly. I always wonder how many people who review Skyrim experience various bugs, as Joseph Anderson calls it, Bethesda's bug, and it's fascinating. Rather than stories playing out differently because of choices that the player makes, stories play out differently because entire sequences have the potential to just not play correctly. If this was my first time playing Skyrim, I might not even be aware that Malborn will attack the guards to buy time for our escape, or that we have the option to try and save him. There's even an extra quest if you help him out later on. All missed because there's a chance the quest will break. We make our escape, and now let's review the 4 documents we got our hands on. The dragon investigation document reveals that, well, the Thalmor are investigating the dragons. They've been interrogating people, a practice Elwyn even participates in, but so far have nothing to report. In other words, fuck you, Delphine. Speaking of, we have her dossier. The Thalmor refer to the Great War as the First War, which, okay. The dossier reveals that the Blades have been carrying out operations inside the Aldmeri Dominion, in which Delphine was a primary participant. She'll say that the Grandmaster of the Blades saw the Thalmor as the biggest threat to Tamriel, but that still implies that the Aldmeri Dominion was actually justified in going to war with the Empire. I know that is a controversial statement because they're, you know, evil, but there wasn't really supporting lore prior to Skyrim that Bethesda had to comply with, that the Aldmeri Dominion had to be ethno-nationalists aiming to exterminate mankind. They came up with literally all of this for this game. They could have taken this story in any direction they wanted to. Skipping 200 years is a pretty good way to liberate yourself of prior lore. How interesting would it be if the Aldmeri Dominion was actually a shade of grey, that the Blades may have actually been in the wrong? But they aren't, because they're evil, and every story involving them reinforces that fact. The dossier doesn't really elaborate on what exactly Delphine has done, and reads more like hype material for a wrestling match. Oh, she took out an entire assassination team, alone. She works alone, which means we can't find her. You need overwhelming force to stop her. She might actually be a wizard. Hey, have you tried fireballs? It's a shame because this is a great opportunity to really fill in the blanks on Delphine's character, especially stuff she might not have an interest in telling us. The next dossier to mention is Esbern's. He's actually our next lead, and I've mentioned him before. He was the Blade's lore master, handled various intelligence operations, and it actually tells us that he was behind an incident, as well as a prison break inside the Aldmeri Dominion's borders. Esbern's also stated to be an expert on dragon lore, and that the Blades had advanced expertise on dragons due to their Akaviri origin, and that Cloud Ruler Temple was destroyed by the Thalmor. Wait, you're telling me the forces of Mehrunes Dagon weren't able to assault the temple, but that the Thalmor successfully pulled it off? Yeah, chalk up another point of evidence for the Mehrunes Dagon theory. Anyways, the document ends by stating that Esbern is in Riften, so we kind of need to hurry if we're going to save him. And of course, there's the final dossier about Ulfric Stormcloak, which I discussed during the Civil War. The only notable detail here is that the Thalmor say that they didn't have to interrupt his execution due to Alduin's coincidental arrival. Also, you can't show Ulfric's dossier to Delphine, who seems like she would absolutely be able to validate this information and wouldn't really appreciate hanging out with Thalmor plants. She's crazy and doesn't like the fact that the Thalmor are actually behind the dragons returning. She suggests we get to Riften. If you're part of the Thieves Guild, she'll point to the Ragged Flagon, otherwise she points to Brynjolf and also gives us a passphrase for dealing with Esbern. Now, this is the first of 3 instances where the main quest will put you in a position of joining one of the side factions. If you're a lemming who only follows the quest markers, then you're forced to meet with Brynjolf and have to go through his scheme that if you can't pass a hard persuasion check, requiring speech level 75 or 53 with the perk. I really hate Brynjolf's line for failing this check. Like, listen to how stupid this is.
Besides, you look like your pockets are a little light on coin. Am I right?
Let me find him first. Dragons are bad for business.
Passing on a golden opportunity is worse.
The only response to someone saying that is, what, are you stupid? However, this isn't as lock and stock an option as it seems. Who's the first person you talk to in an area where you need information? That's right, the local tavern keeper. Now, another YouTuber by the handle of Nocturnal Rambler mentioned this, arguing that because the quest marker points at Brynjolf, that players are discouraged from investigating and thus forced to join the Thieves Guild, even if that is outside of their moral alignment. My issue with this is that Elder Scrolls main quests have never been for the lawful good. In Morrowind, we bought a slave to earn the allegiance of an Ashlander tribe, and in Oblivion, we did the bidding of Daedra to acquire their artifact for a ritual. I've always read Elder Scrolls protagonists as being the type to believe in the ends justifying the means. Generally heroic, but prepared to commit moral evils for the greater good. Even then, however, Skyrim still gives you an out. Even if the white marker makes it impossible for you to think of asking around, you can just fail Brynjolf's scheme, keeping Branche out of jail. Yeah, you'll have a bounty after, and Brynjolf will be upset, but the quest continues. Also, during the Thalmor torture session, he'll verbally say that Esbern's in the Ratway. The Ratway is an obvious feature of Riften, which can be found with casual inspection of the city. Trust me, I've been to Riften, it's not that big. And there are other conversations with more options, like the ones Nocturnal Rambler proposes. Vekel the Man can be bribed, while Dirge can be bribed or brawled with. You'll end up finding Esbern at the very bottom of the Ratway, locked behind a thick door, which you'll open for an easy speech check. I did mention this earlier, but I want to reiterate, it is kind of weird that a man who's been living in a sewer for, I would assume, quite a while, is somehow better adjusted than Delphine. Delphine had 2 different tests to earn her trust, but Esbern, he just takes our word for it that we're the Dragonborn. Let me doctor this slightly. If we fail every attempt to earn Esbern's trust, then we use the passphrase as the last resort, but shock and horror, it actually fails as well. Then the Thalmor show up, we kill them, and Esbern, who watched the fight through the door, decides to trust us. Could be a Thalmor trap, sure, but at this point he knows his cover's blown. After all, if we really were a Thalmor agent, all we would have to do is just wait outside his door for a week or 2 until he's starved to death, and maybe occasionally blast it with a fireball. I mean, I assume things like food are constraints for mortals like Esbern. I was blasting his place with firebolts when he said,
I know, hurry.
In the saddest old man voice possible. This is one of the few times I ever felt bad about doing something in Skyrim. This is the voice of the late Max von Sydow in one of his only video game appearances. Unfortunately, I cannot say it was his only game appearance, which would actually be kind of cool, because he played an exceptionally minor character in The Force Awakens, meaning that he was in LEGO Star Wars.
Something far worse has happened to you.
Thanks, Disney. Anyways, while he puts on a great performance, it is fucking wasted on this character. Esbern is seriously pathetic. Let's consider his peers. Caius Casades hid from the secret police by pretending to be a skooma addict, and he was so dedicated to the part that he even got addicted. Meanwhile, Joffrey pretended to be a monk at a priory and was so dedicated to his part that he actually worshipped the divines. Esbern's idea of hiding is literal. It entirely relied on nobody noticing that at the bottom of the Ratway was a man needing constant food deliveries. Unfortunately, obscurity itself doesn't work forever, and the story literally draws attention to the fact that his cover sucked. The big clue that was given away was that Esbern is old and lived in Riften. I'm sorry, but getting away could not be easier. Pretend to be a fisherman and spend your days angling. You get to live in a secluded location and don't have to involve anybody else in your sustenance. Can you imagine how many old fishermen there are in Skyrim? Okay, here's the inherent difficulty. Esbern has to be obscure, but not so obscure that it would be literally impossible for us to find him. One way to present Esbern as intelligent, but also possible to find, would be to have Delphine know where he's located. I don't think this is a particularly good change because it removes the attempt at creating a sense of tension by removing the time component of rescuing Esbern. Perhaps then you create a reason for Delphine knowing Esbern's location but electing not to make contact. I mean, there is already a reason. Delphine refuses to make contact with old blades out of self-preservation. Her paranoia is paid off, and even the Thalmor acknowledge this. Perhaps Delphine keeps tabs on old Blades members, but refuses to contact Esbern until absolutely necessary, when no other options are available. There is no story need for Esbern and Delphine to have a positive relationship, so here's my change. While we're raiding the embassy for information, Delphine's inn is actually also raided for information. She was compromised when she made contact with us because the Thalmor have been tracking our movements. She reveals that we need to find and warn Esbern because there were enough clues needed to piece together his location. I don't think this worsens Delphine's character because her only mistake was in contacting us. But it does mean that Esbern could only be found by one of his subordinates and not, some homeless guy in Riften. I guess that doesn't include a soft introduction for the Thieves Guild, but who cares? Plus, we get to see part of Riverwood get attacked, meaning that there are actual stakes, and it's still less evil than on Kano. So Esbern and Delphine are reunited. Just as a reminder, Delphine is in her 50s and Esbern is in his 70s, which I think is important to remember when you mod Delphine to look like a sex doll. She's my father's age, and my father was many things, including a soldier. Soldiering's hard work, particularly in the knees. I doubt my father would be very effective against a dragon. I'm just saying, Esbern looks like he should be in his 80s, while Delphine is most a day from her 40th birthday. Paranoid people tend to age faster due to the stress of constantly worrying about the traffic cones that keep stalking them. Esbern's got that look nailed. You're telling me she isn't a wizard, but she clearly knows some illusion magic. Something I love about this reunion, beyond the awkward blocking, is that Delphine suggested we get Esbern to put us back on the right track to fight the dragons, and it is all, what does Alduin's Wall have to do with dragons? I don't know, is there a book on your table that discusses the relationship between the Akaviri and dragons? Something else I like is that Esbern loosely describes the location of Skyhaven Temple, and Delphine immediately intuits where it must be. It's not really a well-hidden location suited for establishing a base of operations if you can guess its location with a single clue, that it's in the Reach. That's only a massive section of land with many currently existing military camps. If you take Delphine's advice to take the cart to Markarth and approach it from the west, then you can see the temple from the ground. I thought that was artistic liberties because otherwise I would imagine scholars from all over Tamriel would have chartered expeditions to that area if it was actually just supposed to be something everybody who travels the road's familiar with. This is also going to be the only time the main quest ever involves the Forsworn. Actually, now that I think about it, this is pretty much the only time in any of the quest lines that the Forsworn are directly involved, and they're just cannon fodder on the way to our true objective. It's actually kind of funny how few quests would be affected by just deleting the Forsworn from the game files. How long would it take the average Skyrim player to even notice? So inside of this dungeon is another dungeon, which the Forsworn have just actively decided not to live in. It's not haunted. Even if it were, I doubt that would deter the magically inclined Forsworn. They just actively and conveniently decided that this open living space was not worth expanding into, or to try climbing up and moving into the ruins proper. Nope. They got stopped by this intense Akaviri puzzle, which is coincidentally the same as most Nordic picture block puzzles already in this game. Seriously, this is what stopped the advance of the Forsworn. Esbern tries to dress it up because the solution is that one of the symbols means Dragonborn and you need to hit 3 Dragonborns, which is the equivalent of setting a rotary lock code to 000, except at least most rotary locks have 10 possible options for each digit in the code. There are only 27 possible answers to this puzzle. The only other thing here is the pressure plate maze, which, you guessed it, you have to follow the Dragonborn symbols. I'm pretty sure a crow could figure out through trial and error how to solve this one. Let's complain about puzzles for a second. I don't really have anything to say that they didn't already say in the Oblivion video, so to reiterate, Bethesda needs somebody on their team with a background in puzzle games. Puzzles should be used in stuff like the College of Winterhold and Thieves Guild. And the games also need more mechanics that you can build puzzles off of. I would also incorporate puzzles in the broader dungeon designs, but communicate that doing puzzles is an optional side activity with additional rewards. The reason Skyrim puzzles are so bad is because the player is forced to do them, but Bethesda doesn't want to create a puzzle so complex that players get trapped. So the vast majority are just these spinning block puzzles of Match the Animals that we all graduated out of around the age of 6. It's the worst of both worlds because the puzzles are still a speed bump for gamers who don't want that experience, but completely worthless for anybody who does. It's a curious thing. I don't really know what the designers played the week they decided they needed puzzles in a lot of their dungeons. Oblivion had the odd puzzle here and there that was simple, but it was spiced to endless fort ruins, caves, and Aelia dungeons. But I'm guessing they just came up with the spinning block puzzle, and for a few weeks level designers were putting them in all the dungeons without any real regard for how they would appear in the complete picture. Remember, when a level is designed in this kind of game, it's usually done in a sterile environment without the rest of Skyrim. Bethesda themselves might have backed up from the finished mural to realize how ridiculous it is, given that Dawnguard and Dragonborn both eased off the idea. Even more ridiculous is how there's a chest at the end of this quote-unquote dungeon complete with loot. I love this, it's the most cynical of design decisions. There are a lot of ridiculous boss chests in Skyrim, but this takes the cake, because at least in a Nordic or Dwemer ruin it makes some sense for there to be loot to acquire. Sometimes you might run into an issue of a leveled list putting a book in an area that was visited in a year prior to that book's publication. First, you have the simple element that the designers assumed the players would reach this point, not see a loot chest, and their dopamine centers would immediately enter withdrawal. Then you have the element of wondering how this chest is even still here. See aforementioned problems with assuming that nobody can reach this point. Then you have to wonder who put this chest here, why, and why they decided to store these particular items in this location. Skyrim tends to gamify loot quite a bit. There's definitely an element of the game standardizing its formula to say that at the end of a dungeon, there is a big chest with big loot inside it. It's actually not that different from how Oblivion handled boss chests, although dungeons becoming hyperlinear corridors means it's much easier to tell that after the phase of the dungeon where you fight the boss, there has to be a phase of the dungeon with a big chest full of big loot. Part of the unmemorable nature of Skyrim dungeons is owed to their radiance. Morrowind incorporated leveled lists as a solution to the main problem of level designers often and loudly complained about: random clutter. Rather than populating every single crate in Morrowind with preset loot, most of them instead pull from a list of items that randomly determines what's inside. However, the actual rewards from dungeons were still handcrafted, because that's the fun part. As an example, I'm going to read a quote from the UESP that describes the loot found in the dungeon Koga rune, which is explored at around the same stage in Morrowind's main quest that we're currently at. The halls hold relics of House Dagoth as well as fallen adventurers, one of whom carries the unique claymore Fury and an incomplete set of glass armor. There is also a glass halberd beside the table near the dead adventurer. A dead Khajiit in a nearby cell is carrying an ebony short sword. Other notable items are a 6th House bellhammer in the Temple of Fae, an ebony spear sticking from a desk in the Hall of the Watchful Touch, and a dwarven mace lying in a crate in the Nibith Waterway. Finally, in the Bleeding Heart section, you can find a pair of Daedric gauntlets, an Orcish warhammer, and the Shadow Shield. All of those items I just listed were deliberately placed in the game world by a level designer, and that's just one dungeon. A main quest dungeon perhaps, but the fact is that in Morrowind, items were placed in the world with deliberate intention. You didn't find those items in a chest sitting behind Dagoth Uthal, you found them placed throughout the world like they actually existed for a purpose. Equipment on dead adventurers, a hammer next to a set of bells, equipment spread out like it's actually being used instead of just sitting around waiting for an adventurer to pick it up. My favorite instance is the only Daedric spear in the game, which can be found skewered through a skeleton hanging over a fireplace in a Dunmer stronghold that's been overrun with Daedra. If this was Skyrim, then Daedric spears would just start showing up in boss chests at level 42. The reason that Oblivion switched to its level-scaled loot solution had to do with the change over to level scaling. You don't want enemies finding in-game loot in a dungeon they complete at level 6, right? Even though out of the list from earlier, there isn't really a complete collection of items for any one character. Having Daedric gauntlets is good, if you happen to find them, but you still had many other gear slots that would need filling. It was an adequate reward for doing something adequately dangerous. However, because Skyrim characters are assumed to be comprehensive, that means there needs to be a start point and end point of the progression system. Start with Iron, end with Daedric. Add tiers along the way to provide incremental upgrades. Even when you find something unique, it often isn't. Red Eagle's Fury is still just a Draugr sword that does 5 points of fire damage. Compare that with Fury. This is still just a silver claymore, except when you wield it, it'll blind you 20%, drain your armor skills by 20 points, but fortify your attack rating by 20. That enchantment is literally the description of the concept of Fury turned into a weapon enchant and placed into the hands of a dead adventurer. You're telling me that Skyrim innovated in environmental storytelling when an entire character's story is told by just the numbers on an item. So, not only is there an inherent lack of personality to Skyrim's leveled loot system, but it is also placed in such a way as to be insulting. No good deed done for free. It only worked for a multitude of near-worthless items that ended up sitting in a cupboard and occasionally liquidated for no reason other than I wanted the gold number to be 6 digits instead of 5. I have to be rewarded for cave time. I have to loot all the urns for minor amounts of currency. Please, don't stop the dopamine drip. So we've arrived at Skyhaven Temple, which has yet to be breached due to a blood sigil requiring a healthy donation of Dragonborn blood. Whoa, why are you cutting your hand like that? Okay, so I just wounded my left hand through the gauntlet. Not gonna be able to wield a shield for a couple days. Seriously, cut an open section of skin, or anything other than your fighting hand. Apparently the Akaviri are into blood magic now, or at least Esbern pulls as much out of his ass. The only basis for this is the Duskfang and Dawnfang sword from the Shivering Isles, which was called a blood-drinking sword. You would think that if it was a type of magic that could identify blood types in the setting, that this would appear much more frequently. Sounds like a fast way to ensure people aren't raiding the family tomb if you have a ward up that literally prevents anyone not of your race from entering. You might say Nords are anti-magic, and it's true, but they weren't always that way. During the days when most ancient Nordic crypts were built, the clever men were still around. What about the Dwemer? Why bother with the automatons and puzzles? Just put up a blood test. Good luck getting past that one when they're all gone. Actually, spoilers for later, but they did for one very specific thing, and it's even part of the main quest, so I guess magic blood tests are just part of the setting now. We head into the temple. Esbern's remarking on all the stone carvings while Delphine's going around lighting all the braziers. It's a good attention to detail that Delphine lights the room with her torch. I just wish they would show the same attention to detail in the rest of the dungeons. This is where Esbern reads off and explains Alduin's wall.
Everything is couched in allegory and mythic symbolism.
Yeah, okay, nice way to wave off questions. Esbern says the first panel goes back to the beginning of time, but then says that the dragons and the dragon cult were around for that, so I'm not sure if he's saying that he thinks that or that the Akaviri who carved this wall think the men were always here, but they weren't. And that's a plot point in Skyrim of how men were immigrants from Atmora. You hear that, Ysgramor and the Falmer? No point in the Night of Tears because men always lived here. Alduin's wall was a part of the game's marketing. It was one of the 2 framing devices of the official trailer that Esbern narrated over. So if you got excited about getting to see the full wall at your leisure and learning about all the details that were on it, prepare to be disappointed. So the left 60% of the wall is a historical recounting of basically the Dragon War. Not sure where Esbern got the idea that it represented the beginning of time. My first issue is that the dragons are already burning things at this point, meaning that this is likely an extremely biased perspective of the story. It makes sense on account of the fact that the Dragon War took place in the late Merithic era, while the Akaviri invasion of Tamriel happened in the First Era in the year 2703. However, there's a lore book in Skyrim dating the construction of the wall between the years 2812 and 2816, so because it sounds better, we'll call it even at 3 millennia having passed between the events on this wall and the wall's construction. To give you perspective, 3,000 years ago in our own world was a time period where most humans on Earth were still living as hunter-gatherers, and civilization was located pretty much exclusively around big rivers. This was the era of Solomon, who was the son of David, which, if you can't guess, were Hebrew kings written about in the Bible. Now, trying to aggregate knowledge and understanding about people from a time period so long ago is extremely difficult. I mean to the point that there had been 3,000 years of things that happened in Skyrim, including an Akaviri invasion that destroyed a bunch of stuff. But then the Dragon Guard, which is what they were called at the time, decided to take their premier expert in dragon lore and commit their knowledge to stone. But rather than simply carving out an efficient explanation of their understanding of the history, complete with ciphers just in case, they decided to, what were the words? Coach it in allegory and mythic symbolism? Basically, they created a near-useless sculpture of an anachronistic understanding of events that Esbern can somehow intuit useful information from because the plot demands it. Funny thing is, remember that lore book I mentioned? It's from the specific era of this carving. It's literally a log of the events of Skyhaven Temple written in the first person, of an individual recording the events of the construction of Alduin's wall. They could have written the history in the margins and it would have been immensely more useful. Esbern reveals that the ancient Dragonborn used to shout to defeat Alduin, which upsets Delphine because it means that they have to involve the Greybeards in our mission. Fortunately for her, that won't be for a minute as we have a Blades to rebuild. There's a pretty big reason why we're going to do this now, with the return of the dragons looming over us, rather than later. The place to start is to bring any follower to Delphine to induct into the Order. They'll even take an oath of loyalty. It's pretty cool, and it's one of the few advantages Skyrim's hireling system has over Fallout's dedicated followers. See, in the Fallout games, there is a limited roster of followers, but each one will be a fully fledged character. At least, that's the idea, not necessarily commenting on the execution. Skyrim, however, casts a much wider net, with a wide variety of characters to be recruited, albeit at the cost of individual quality.
We are approaching it in a in a different way. I would not expect the deep personalities and uniqueness with a low number of companions. We are aiming for a much, much higher number of companions you could hire or that become your friends and they come with you. It's something we're messing with, and we'll probably talk about more later, but the general direction is to make it a bit more dynamic and have more people that you could decide to bring with you. In that, we sacrifice them having a lot of depth or personalities or individual stories. We were playing the game a few months back where anybody could become your companion.
Oh, yeah?
And I don't think we're going to do that after playing it.
There are some neat things about this system. For instance, every character in the game has a morality level, which affects their behavior in relation to crime. So for instance, Findel in Riverwood refuses to commit crimes. I cannot order him to steal a book in Arcadia's shop in Whiterun for me. Sven, his rival, is willing to steal that skill book, but will not assault or murder anyone for me. Mjol the Lioness has no such qualms, despite her personal crusade against the Thieves Guild. She can be ordered to commit whatever crimes we tell her to. Okay, maybe the system breaks down a little in detail. Most followers either won't commit any crimes or will commit any crime, and Sven is actually the exception as he's the only follower with the flag distinguishing his individual morality. Sometimes the NPCs will have the correct morality for their character, unless the implication is that Mjol is actually okay with crime and is just putting up appearances of being against it. Another thing is aggressiveness. Some followers are actually more or less aggressive than others, affecting whether or not they will initiate combat with hostiles. Followers also have different levels of confidence, meaning that cowards like Benor are more likely to run from fights. The biggest difference comes down to NPC skill levels, affecting what equipment or magic they'll use. It's not perfect. For instance, the reason I favor J'zargo as a companion wasn't just to fully recreate the Baron Zaya experience. J'zargo actually has no upper level cap, meaning that while most followers fall off around level 30, J'zargo will keep advancing with the player. That said, most of this information is not expressly told to the player in a spreadsheet of stats, meaning that without a guide, you just have to experiment and eventually notice that some companions are better or more compatible with your playstyle than others. It's one of those systems designed to be subtle, but it's so subtle it practically doesn't exist. This is how you end up with the majority of Skyrim reviews using the same companion. The problem with Skyrim followers is, again, a lack of character. It almost would work better as a party system, where you could keep inviting new members to the party, but maybe the game would increase the difficulty or number of spawns per AI companion you bring into the squad. My favorite aspect of J'zargo was equipping him with gear. At times, it really did feel like he was getting more upgrades than I was. Having a crew of followers would mean that one character getting a gear upgrade could mean that everyone down the line also would get a gear upgrade. It could also make support magic much more useful. It seems like the logical advantage of having a quantity of companions over quality, but I doubt they will go that route in Elder Scrolls 6 simply due to complaints about how bland the companions in Skyrim are. Sometimes quantity over quality can be a good thing. It's just that if you keep it the same where you can only have one follower, like in Fallout, it makes it too easy to make the comparison. Serana in Dawnguard was definitely a response to issues players had with the default companions in Skyrim. We'll have plenty to say about her in the Dawnguard section.
I'm gonna find you and put a bullet in that inflated fucking head of yours.
So we need some followers to sacrifice to the Blades, and J'zargo is way too good for such a faction. Since the Blades use heavy armor, one-handed swords, and bows, it's best to pick followers that use that exact skill set. Goldir is a Nord hanging outside his family crypt, which has been defiled by a necromancer. His aunt is already in the ruin trying to deal with the problem. However, one weird thing to note is that apparently his family and the necromancer never saw eye to eye on things. I mean, that's literally true, sure, but what exactly were your interactions with him prior to him taking your dead relatives as servants? Were you neighbors and upset that he didn't mow his lawn more frequently? Why introduce the idea that Goldir's family actually knows this guy?
He's gone in to defile our family tomb by using our ancestors for his filthy dark elf necromancy.
But you have a higher purpose in life, so I'll let it slide. It's funny that Goldir will actually comment about you looting.
Hey, those belong to my family.
Also, Val's Varen during our fight with him teleports around the room. He's actually not the only boss in Skyrim to do this, which I completely forgot about. So the enemies can still teleport, and even some select friends, but not the player. I mean, at least they gave a canon lampshade for levitation, no matter how stupid it is. So after we've done Goldir this favor and given him time to put his aunt to rest, we can recruit him and take him to Delphine to induct him into the Blades. Okay, that's alright. A short little side quest with some fun world details you don't typically see, like acknowledging that the bodies and belongings inside the crypts actually belong to people and aren't just free for the taking, at least morally. Alright, let's take a step down. Our next victim is Uthgerd the Unbroken, a woman spending her days at the Bannered Mare picking fistfights.
You've been talking to those companions? Too hot-headed, they cried. Weak, pathetic cowards, the lot of them. It wasn't my fault. I told them over and over that it was an accident. They wanted me to prove my worth. So they threw me up against a young whelp of the lad, hardly old enough to grow his first chin hairs.
Shut the fuck up.
Don't let him get away with it!
Drive that snow back to the ground. Come on!
You're tougher than you look.
I guess I thought a woman wasn't strong enough to hurt him. I didn't mean for him to die. Why would I want that? I just lost control.
I don't know, sounds like you'd fit right in with the circle. Sorry, but I have immense doubt the same companion Zayela is a ranking member in couldn't handle the sight of a strong Nord woman and decided to pit her against some random. Anyways, you can put 100 drakes down in a brawl with her, and if you win, you can recruit her as a follower. It's funny the extent she trusts you as well, because afterwards her house becomes free access for us. Also funny is how she gets inducted into another militant order because she lost a wager. This strips the specialness back just a little. I mean, Gold Deer we could at least say was a friend. One more step down to go. Vorstag is a mercenary from Markarth that can be hired for 500 gold. As a character, he has pretty much nothing going on, making a single interesting observation tied to his skill set about a character in a quest in the city. When it comes to generic Skyrim followers, Vorstag fits the bill. He's a product of quantity. Well, because we dropped 500 Gs on him, he's willing to swear his life to the cause of the Blades. I like this selection because not only does each companion have a skill set good for the Blades, unless you play with the unofficial patch, but they also expose a pretty big flaw in how Skyrim handles disposition. None of these characters should have joined the Blades. Something I omitted from the Goldear story is that he's kind of a coward, but we can still make a man out of him yet. Uthgerd? Well, her resume isn't promising, having already been fired from one of my other companies for reasons that absolutely pertain to her prospective position as a Blade. She also trusts too easily, which could be a liability when dealing with the Thalmor. Elder Scrolls traditionally handled disposition by assigning almost every NPC in the game a numerical value between 0 and 100 that represented how well that NPC trusted or liked you. A big thing is that the game generally told you what that number was. In Morrowind, it would even tell you in the same panel as where all the dialogue was happening, so if you did something to improve or hurt their disposition, you would see the effect immediately. The system wasn't perfect. Morrowind didn't have a morality flag, so for instance, you could be talking to a knight whose honor cannot be bought and slip him 100 gold for a boost. However, and think about this honestly, how many people do you know that wouldn't do someone a minor favor for a Benjamin or even a Jackson? No, the issue isn't bribery. In fact, bribery was great because it gave people a route of last resort at a mechanical cost. If you didn't have the skills like speechcraft or illusion to affect disposition, then you had to spend money. Imagine if Razalin demanded 500 gold as compensation for causing a scene. I'm sure the only reason Bethesda still doesn't do this is simply the idea crossing their mind that someone, somewhere, somehow, would not have 500 gold at this point in the questline. Oblivion would improve the system in theory by adding infamy. Reputation in Morrowind meant that over time you'd see disposition boosts simply by being a hero. Yeah, saving the world actually meant that many merchants were giving you a discount, or that other quests would be easier due to your, well, reputation. The reason the idea isn't given its due is because Morrowind doesn't plant a giant flashing neon sign over this mechanic. Oblivion would divide reputation into fame and infamy. NPCs would like you more the more fame you had, but would dislike you as you accrued infamy. However, immoral NPCs would have more complex feelings and may even like you more for being infamous. It had its flaws, but I think it had potential. And then there's Skyrim. Skyrim shifts the disposition to a spectrum from -4 to +4, with negative numbers meaning negative relationships, and you can guess what positive numbers mean. You cannot affect dispositions directly with speech. Instead, you either do quests to make the number go up or kill loved ones to make the numbers go down. This means that instead of NPCs having variable feelings about the player, NPCs will usually be somewhere between mildly annoyed and pleasantly surprised to see you again, because most NPCs are either a -1, a 0, or a +1. Since the system is missing a ton of granularity, it means that Skyrim NPCs tend to be mostly like this.
Well, I trust you. Like, to a weird degree, actually.
Doing minor favors for people makes them far too trusting. It would be like saying that after I help get your car out of a ditch, that I go over to your house, sleep in your bed, and eat all of your food because I earned that +1 relationship with you. How about instead of -4 to +4, we have a system that starts at 0 and then goes to 100? And then that number would go up or down based on player actions. With followers specifically, maybe the number goes up each time we kill a boss together, and we'll call this system disposition. Because sure, recruiting Vorstag into the Blades after just meeting and hiring his services is pretty stupid, but what about after a few weeks of doing dangerous deeds together? A couple dragons later and Vorstag could be our best friend. The thing is, the system is emergent. My perspective on these companions is different than yours based on our experiences. And there are plenty of stories of heroes entering people's lives and changing their outlooks, to the point that they transform as a character. The problem is not that a sellsword became a sworn sword, but rather that it happened too easily. I think for this quest there should have been a list of companions who would flat out reject being initiated into the Blades. Technically there is, but the list is just Serana, a vampire, and members of the Dark Brotherhood. Apparently you can recruit Dragonborn DLC followers into the Blades though, meaning they had to go back and revisit this idea, at least in terms of writing the dialogue. It's just weird, and I doubt anyone ever casually thought about doing it. There are a multitude of reasons why someone would decline our invitation but would accept the offer to adventure with us. People who have difficulty making long-term commitments, people who are morally or ideologically opposed to the Blades, and people who have already taken oaths for other organizations or purposes to start. I would then have another list of companions requiring a certain disposition level for initiation before they would qualify. They will do it, but they need to trust the player first. With 3 new recruits among our ranks, we can speak with Esbern, who will give us a task to go to a dragon lair to slay a dragon. While this is a Radiant quest and can annoyingly target dragon lairs on Solstheim, it's a good Radiant quest because our new Blades members will come with us on our dragon hunts. That is, of course, mostly just for the spectacle of being part of an actual dragon hunting order. It's not like there are any dragons in Skyrim in which we desperately needed their help defeating. I also enjoy that they made the act of slaying dragons radiant, because it reinforces my earlier point about how stagnant being expected to fight 50 dragons becomes. Esbern also has a quest where we get him a dragon bone and scale, allowing him to research the dragons. Our reward is a potion which, when ingested, gives us a perk causing dragons to do 25% less melee damage. The quest is simple, but man, the prospect of rewarding perks for quests is a missed opportunity, and they awarded it to this nothing quest that's easily missed. See, when Delphine sent us out to investigate the shout we needed to defeat Alduin, there weren't many opportunities during the quest line to return to Skyhaven Temple. Simply put, engaging with this content requires you to go out of your way, but the Blades are going to betray us. Specifically, Delphine and Esbern are going to give us an ultimatum that, unfortunately, is heavily weighted against the Blades. So what is that about? Well, let's get into it. Remember that shout we needed to defeat Alduin? Delphine somehow intuits that the shout is able to knock dragons out of the sky, and wait, what's happening?
Rather, Joan Allen knew that this was the gameplay-related effect that the Dragon Wind shout would have, and so she had Delphine say, knock a dragon out of the sky, even though Delphine had no way of knowing that.
Okay, so let's get this straight. Joan Allen, who is the voice actress for Delphine, a woman whose only video game credit is Skyrim and who would have been 55 years old at the time of recording, had inside knowledge of the specific mechanics surrounding this shout and decided to improvise a line about those mechanics. That is a more likely explanation than simply assuming that either the writers messed up the continuity or that Esbern originally had a line explaining what he thought the shout would do that was cut. Anyways, it's back to High Hrothgar to ask the Greybeards about the shout, but Arngyr's angry. Subscribe to my Patreon for more quality jokes. Anyways, he's pissed about the Blades because they are always meddling. How old are you? Seriously, I don't think Bethesda has an understanding of, like, linear time. What exactly have the Blades meddled with in regards to the Greybeards in Arngyr's lifetime? It comes off as jealousy that we were cheating on him with a younger old man. Anyways, one of the other tongues decides to lash him for this, which translated says that we're Dragonborn and we need to speak to Parthenax. You should know who Parthenax is if you read the tablets on the way up the mountain, but if you can't guess from the context clues, or you've just been fast traveling up here, he is actually a dragon. First, we have to use the Clear Skies shout to clear a path up to the top of the mountain, which this section has always been off to me. It's possible its only purpose is to try and prevent players from heading up to the top before the right point in the main quest line, which is just sad. Like in Morrowind, at any time, you could just go hang out with Vivek or Dagoth Ur. It was cool. You could even try killing them, or if you were powerful enough, you would. Oblivion didn't have anything like that. The closest was Shale Gorath in the Shivering Isles DLC, but they wussed out and had him kill you in a scripted sequence if you tried to fight him. I mean, the advantage of Parthenax being a flying dragon is that he could just, like, not be there. Anyways, my problem with Clear Skies is that it has little mechanical use. Apparently you can stagger enemies with it if you were somehow having difficulty doing that in the first place, but since there's no survival mechanics or even really rough weather, it's pointless. It was kind of odd realizing that it doesn't really rain in Skyrim. We meet with Parthenax, and since he's a dragon, I think it's fitting to do this part out of chronological order because I have a rant. The Blades? Well, they are going to issue us an ultimatum to kill Parthenax. Unlike the Civil War choice, which is debated to this day, the Parthenax dilemma was settled pretty much in 2011. The problem is that the Blades section of the story was useless. You could actually cut that entire chunk of the story out and the main queue would largely be the same. Delphine forcibly inserts herself into the middle of a quest, takes us off on a side adventure for a while, leading us to a piece of information that the thing we needed the entire time was with the people we already knew and were studying under. Literally, all we had to do to meet with Parth was just ask. Arngir says we need to be patient initially, but literally all that's changed is that Einarth happened to overhear the conversation and decided to intervene this time. To give a comparison, it would be like returning to Cloud Ruler Temple after acquiring all the copies of the Mythic Dawn commentaries, only for Martin to remark that he already owned all the books, and the only reason he didn't mention it sooner was that nobody had asked. What exactly about Alduin's Wall made it so that Einarth happened to overhear the conversation, or decide that now was the time? The answer is nothing, it's purely coincidental. In fact, it's fair to say that the Blades bring nothing to the entire story. No, really, from this point forward, we never have to engage with them again. When we go to fight Alduin, the Blades aren't there, even if we do as Delphine bids. I just have a massive problem with the Blades. The originals were experts in dragon lore and slaying, for a species that was largely exterminated thousands of years before their founding. I don't think anyone at Bethesda even really considered this. I know they have a history of cutting through canon if it means telling a better story, but is this better? If Bethesda can't understand how long 200 years is in the Fallout games, then they definitely won't understand how long 3,000 years is, or the fact that there would be another 1,000 years until the present. Yet somehow Delphine has decided that her purpose in life is now dragon slaying, to such a degree that she is actually brave enough to go against us on this issue, citing her oath as a blade. I'm not one of those people that will argue that they're blades and blades have to serve the Dragonborn. However, it is definitely the case that the second you actually do what this stupid bitch asks, you are her subservient.
Who works for who?
It is sad because they drag Esbern into this, but Delphine receives pretty much 100% of the flack for this. Deservingly so. Let me follow your logic here, Delphine. You refuse to serve me until I kill one very specific dragon, so that means the Blades now can't serve their functions as dragon slayers because there isn't going to be a dragonborn around to suck up their souls if I say no. Is there? You're fucked. Because even if you manage to put a dragon in the ground without me, Alduin could just get him back up in short time. You know that. You were there. Are you going to stake out every dragon burial site in Skyrim while your order is being hunted by the Thalmor? Fact is, there is no Blades without the Dragonborn, not the direction Delphine wants to take it. How exactly are you preserving your oath? Parthenax is, well, a good dragon. There are, however, plenty of bad dragons still out there rampaging right now, not getting killed because the Blades refuse to serve me. Is that not a violation of your oath, Delphine? The only argument I've heard against this is that if the Dragonborn dies while Parthenax is alive, that nobody will be around to stop him in the future. Okay, again, what about all the other dragons that are still alive? If we are, factually, canonically, set in concrete and preserved forever, the last Dragonborn, then that means that all it takes is for one singular dragon to evade us until after the time of our death for this to be the case. Except that dragon, and let's be honest, the ones around him, will not have Parthenax around to try and guide them. I wonder if we're going to end up meeting a dragon that we can't actually slay. See, Parthenax is the actual leader of the Greybeards, having been the dragon to teach men how to use the Thu'um. He spends most of his days atop the throat of the world meditating, although he admits that at one time he did visit another dragon. Spoilers for the end, but after Alduin's defeat, Parthenax will leave the throat to go discuss his philosophy with other dragons. His goal is to encourage more dragons to adopt his own lifestyle of meditation rather than dominance. But Parthenax does admit that it is a struggle against his nature to maintain this lifestyle, so the argument goes that all it takes is one bad day for Parth to become a giant murderous lizard again.
My name is not important. What is important is what I'm going to do. I just fucking hate this world, and these human worms feasting on its carcass. My whole life is just cold, bitter hatred.
It hasn't happened in 4,000 years, but it's possible, so we gotta put him down and restore the peace. I'm sorry, but this logic is fundamentally flawed. It's human nature to bash people across the head with clubs and fucking murder them for their food. That's not a joke. The physiology of our wrists is literally adapted to using weaponry. Modern, civilized people still have visceral reactions to having their food taken from them, despite there generally being no rational reason to do so. So, for instance, let's assume there's a human organization. Their origin was from a military campaign that involved a long trek across the ocean, but ended in a massive swath of devastation across the countryside, killing untold countless people. Their military brutality is infamous to the point of being remembered to this day, thousands of years later. It's long past time for them to pay for their crimes, which are even as recent as 20 years ago during unsanctioned intelligence operations in foreign countries that sparked a continent-wide war. Now, this organization claims to have reformed, that they serve a nobler purpose now. They became dragon slayers in a world where dragons were mostly gone and where they managed to slay a single dragon in 5 years. They would later reform again into an organization that served as bodyguards of the Emperor. You probably have picked up on my point, but the funny part is that I included verbatim quotes from Delphine in my comparison of the Blades to Parthenax. The only difference is that Parthenax is a single continuous entity while the Blades are a collection of individuals. However, this is applying the logic of punishment to an entity outside of conventional punishments. In essence, can you really call it justice to punish people who are immortal the same way you punish people who are not? Parthenax has been alive continuously ever since the Dragon War. We don't know the extent of his crimes, which by itself makes Delphine's case dubious. It's undeniable that he did ill, but if Delphine can't actually quantify her arguments, then it's effectively meaningless. She's read from records I've already showed are faulty that Parthenax was a lieutenant of Alduin, meaning that he must have done bad things, even though I'm sure the local Nords at the time were all much more aware of that. Parth is actually pretty similar to the dragon Thief from Dark Souls, a dragon that betrayed his own kind to give people the tool they needed to end the reign of dragons. Except the gods in Dark Souls awarded Thief for his decision. But I mean, Parthenax is immortal. He could do most anything, yet he's decided to live alone for thousands of years. That is a historical punishment. It's called exile, and he's been living in it for longer than 99% of mortals have been alive.
It's true that his crimes are long in the past, but justice does not count the passage of years.
It actually does. However, my biggest problem with this dilemma is that the biggest witness used to prosecute Parthenax is himself. Literally, his own honesty about his life and actions is the single biggest contributor to the case against him. I call it being hung by your honesty, and it unfortunately happens quite often. People who perform minor acts can be punished worse than people performing major acts simply because they came clean and were honest about it. It's a part of human nature, but it means that people are encouraged to lie about their misdeeds rather than being honest because the punishment for honesty is usually worse. Simply put, you cannot convince me that Parthenax needs to die if the core of your argument is Parthenax's own words. Even trying to play as ruthless a character as possible could not justify this action, because it literally makes too much sense to just let him live. I personally believe that every human on Earth is capable of redemption, but that the worst of criminals require more time than they have left to ever really achieve it. Immortal beings have no such constraint, so logically, that means I believe that immortals could eventually be redeemed of any crime. Plus, Elder Scrolls is a setting with a confirmed afterlife, so it's not like all the people Parthenax killed ceased existence, like what potentially happens in our own world. And, well, it's a bit presumptuous, isn't it? Delta Fear, my mage character, is actually an immortal vampire. She's a powerful necromancer. She's participated in murders and assassinations, changed the course of wars, and is developing an unrivaled ability with the Thuum. I'm just saying, if we're worried about the crimes of the future, you might want to do a little introspection with your character.
He may have betrayed Alduin in the end, but that makes him worse, not better. I have a contact inside the embassy. He's not up for this kind of high-risk mission, but he can help you. His name is Malborn. Wood Elf. Plenty of reason to hate the Thalmor. You can trust him.
Parthenax is one of the cooler characters in Skyrim, probably just because of his uniqueness. He is a dragon, and it's evident that they actually took the time to craft his character around that fact. His pattern of speech and philosophy sets him apart.
Do you have no better reason for acting than destiny? Are you nothing but a plaything of Des, of fate?
There aren't really many other characters in Skyrim written like Parthenax. It's unfortunate then that he must bear the burden of the entire dragon lore upon his back. Rather than us piecing together information about the dragons from the dragons we meet over the course of a quest line, instead the vast majority of lore is just exposited at the player during this conversation. It's through the voice of Charles Martinet, whose Skyrim credit is lost amongst a sea of credits as Mario and Luigi. He was one of the few Bespin cops in Jedi Outcast, funnily enough. I mean no offense by this, but the casting almost sounds like a joke decision that ended up working wonders. It's like someone in the casting department was spitballing ideas about who should voice this dragon character and someone proposed the guy who voiced Mario and everything. The problem is that he is moving in one direction and pretty much everything else is going in the other. Dragons love conversation and do battle with their words, but pretty much all we ever see is them screaming hot and cold. Parthenax spends his days meditating on the meanings of words, yet rather than teaching us a cool new shout, he simply augments our existing combat shouts. Parthenax doesn't know the Dragonrend shout, as it was created by mortals and dragons apparently cannot comprehend its meaning. Apparently it turned the tide on the dragons though, which is confusing. What, did you only teach mortals how to breathe fire? That's nice and all, but it's not exactly much of an edge over what we can already do. In fact, our notable quality is that we can permanently kill dragons, not that our voices themselves do it. Kind didn't need Parthenax to teach the people how to use the Thu'um because it practically teaches itself once you start killing dragons. Parthenax reveals that the ancient Nord Dragonborn did not slay Alduin, but instead used an Elder Scroll to cast him adrift through time, which created a time wound that we could use to observe the event if we were to get our hands on the same Elder Scroll. It's not really time travel, thank God, but more of a remote viewing of the past. It is unfortunate, however, because we will need to find one specific Elder Scroll out of hundreds, if not thousands, that exist, which has likely changed hands many times over the last 4,000 years. At least we can say with certainty that it does still exist, since they're apparently highly durable, but who knows, it could be sitting in a buried Nordic ruin or at the bottom of the ocean. First, we need a clue about where to look, which presents us a choice. We can ask Arngir, who is still mad at us and takes offense but points us towards the College of Winterhold anyways. Or we can ask Esbern, who is recounting a dream he had of Alduin destroying the world, and also points us at the College of Winterhold. What immense insight. It's not like there were very many institutions in Skyrim that could actually offer us advice in this situation.
Not the kind of thing you will find in your local bookshop. Let me think.
Perhaps the College of Winterhold.
This is the second time the player is placed into a position where they will encounter a faction, and the first where you're actually forced through initiation. If this specific quest is the first time you're doing this, then you have an additional dialogue with Feralda where she'll ask you to demonstrate your Thu'um, which, while cool, doesn't mean I necessarily want to be enrolled in your institution. Plus, I'm not really sure what this is for. At least the Thieves Guild pretended to be hidden, so getting pointers to it could be useful. The college is transparently a faction, and you get pointed to it by all the court wizards, including Farengar earlier in the questline. At least I can say about Oblivion that when it sends us to the Arcane University that it didn't actually make us join the Mages Guild. It's just weird that you can't access Skyrim's library without enrolling. Were you guys forcing all those Psijics and Synod members to enroll in the college as well? Like, the Mages Guild was designed around the idea that many people would become associates for safe places to practice magic, hence why they had guild halls all over Vardenfell and Cyrodiil. We head into the library and meet up with Urag. He flat out says the college does not have any Elder Scrolls, nor would he give it to us if he did. He also has a big spiel about how dangerous and esoteric they are. I guess if this was your first Elder Scrolls game 5 mainline titles in, then this part's for you. Not that they really had a big presence in the older games. The idea was basically made up as marketing for Arena and then tacked onto the series, but nobody actually wanted to do anything with the idea until Oblivion, which simply used an Elder Scroll as a plot device to change the properties of the Grey Cow. Then Skyrim came along and made them central to the main questline. Unsurprising really, considering the Oblivion Thieves Guild was done by Bruce Nesmith, who went on to become lead designer on Skyrim. Urag gives us some literature on the topic, one of which details the effects reading the scrolls have. This is mostly just recapping stuff established in Oblivion with the Ancestor Moth Priests. The second book, however, is coached in mythic allegory and symbolism, which is code we're going to use for being effectively gibberish. Urag will remark that, yeah, that is the case. He does actually know who wrote the book, and they apparently even work out of Skyrim for some reason. So back in 4th Era 180, right before the Great War, all the scrolls that were stored in the Imperial Library up and vanished, because it would be really inconvenient to say that the Thalmor had acquired all those Elder Scrolls during their occupation of White Gold Tower. I guess they picked a side. That said, I would imagine if you were an expert in Elder Scrolls that you would still work in Cyrodiil, around the Moth Priests who are going around trying to collect all of them again. It is really convenient that so many people are willing to travel out to Skyrim to facilitate these plots. That's kind of the problem. Post-Oblivion, Bethesda seems to feel the need to make Skyrim a multi-province story, but obviously Cyrodiil is not a part of the play area anymore. It's just bizarre how much is going on in Cyrodiil following the game that was actually set there. I won't be surprised when the most interesting parts of Skyrim are in Elder Scrolls 6. Anyways, we meet this expert in Elder Scrolls lore, but we have to find him first. Not to worry, as the omniscient quest marker knows exactly where to go. Actually, Ureg gives us some extremely specific directions, somewhere up north in the ice fields. Septimus, however, is crazy, stewing in this ice cave trying to open up some Dwemer artifact. As far as I'm aware, Skyrim was the game to include the idea that the Elder Scrolls can drive you mad if you study them. I'd almost say that Septimus Cygnus is a parody of Michael Kirkbride, who didn't get to contribute very much to Skyrim. His ruminations read like an attempt at emulating the writing style of the Mythic Dawn commentaries or the 36 Sermons. How has Septimus survived out here for all these years alone? Don't worry about it, we only said years to really drive home that he's crazy about this. Septimus seems to think the lockbox contains the heart of Lorcan. I guess news didn't get out about that one. Anyways, Septimus wants an exchange for helping us get an Elder Scroll. I want to emphasize that we are really going out on a limb here. We would have to be cosmically fortunate for this plan to actually result in us getting exactly the right scroll. He gives us a couple items and points us towards Alftand. This leads to a fairly lengthy dungeon, marking the first Dwemer ruin of the main quest. There was a research group that was clearing the ruin, but they apparently got devastated. Then they try to hand-wave away the fact that they could have just left by claiming there was a storm outside, so... Of course, they had to go deeper into the ruins to go get murdered, instead of just waiting by the entrance for the blizzard to subside. The Dwemer ruins are marginally more interesting than Nordic ruins, but barely. They've definitely lost their aesthetic edge. Dwemer ruins in Skyrim are mostly just carved stone structures with occasional bands of brass or metal sculptures. Compare that with Dwemer ruins from Morrowind. Everything looked rusted and ancient, and most important of all, unique. The Dwemer ruins of Vardenfell were meant to contrast with the Dunmer strongholds and Daedric ruins. In Skyrim, there's too much emphasis on the stonework and not the metal, meaning that the cultural identity of the dwarves just blends into all the other stone structures we see throughout the games. Rather than selling us on the idea that the Dwemer were a civilization that were rushing the technology tree at the cost of everything else, it's more like what made them superior to the Nords and Falmer was that they had more stonemasons. Not better stonemasons, just more. This is literally the greatest opportunity you could hand to artists in a fantasy setting, the opportunity to blend science fiction and fantasy world design. I grabbed this image from the More Oblivion project, which is a mock-up of a potential redesign of Dwemer ruins. Imagine trudging through multiple Nordic ruins and then suddenly finding this and how refreshing it would be. It's not that outlandish, these are the people who made Fallout 3, but then again, it's unsurprising that this is what they ended up making. These are also the people who made Fallout 3. Alftand is a pretty big dungeon, although at this point, you should know that Skyrim's standard fare for big dungeons is actually just really long hallways. Alftand presents another level design opportunity to take advantage of the Dragon Shouts. I mean, technically non-Dragonborn players are supposed to be able to complete this dungeon due to the Dawnguard DLC, but that's only because Alftand's original design did not incorporate this limitation. In that instance, they could just make it so you use one of the other dungeon entrances to Alftand if you're doing the Dawnguard version of this quest. Our powers so far include Force Push, Forward Dash, Clear Skies, and Parthenax taught us a word of Fire Breath. All of those have potential applications inside of a Dwemer ruin. Unclog stuck machinery with a force normal men don't possess. Dash across chasms or through traps mortals would not be fast enough to evade. Clear rooms full of steam from burst pipes. Melt frozen walls and start up a boiler using fire breath. Ironically, the most useful shout for this dungeon is Become Ethereal, which we are not guaranteed to have learned from Ustengrav in order to negate fall damage and skip a very long vertical section. Right at the end, we run into Amana and Sola Trebatius, who are the heads of that expedition. It kind of comes out of nowhere. Like, yeah, the journals mention their names, but then there was a long stretch where the plot was just